Welcome to goldenageradio.com, rumble.com/C/GAR. Brand new episodes every week. Visit veteransradioministry.com to listen to more episodes like this.
Our opening chapter does not concern itself with love. Indeed, that antagonist does not certainly appear until the third, and Mr. Lewisham is seen at his studies. In those days, he was assistant master in the Wortley Proprietary School, Wortley, Sussex, and his wages were £40 a year, out of which he had to afford 15 shillings a week during term time to lodge with Mrs. Mundy at the little shop in the West Street. He was called Mr. to distinguish him from the bigger boys, whose duty it was to learn, and it was a matter of stringent regulation that he should be addressed as Sir. He wore ready-made clothes. His black jacket of rigid line was dusted about the front and sleeves with scholastic chalk, and his face was downy and his moustache incipient. He was a passable-looking youngster of 18, fair-haired, indifferently barbered, and with a quite unnecessary pair of glasses on his fairly prominent nose. He wore these to make himself look older, that discipline might be maintained. At the particular moment when this story begins, he was in his bedroom. To judge by the room, Mr. Lewisham thought little of love, but much on greatness. Over the head of the bed, for example, where good folks hang texts, these truths asserted themselves, written in a clear, bold, youthfully florid hand. Knowledge is power, and what man has done, man can do. Man, in the second instance, referring to Mr. Lewisham. And over the yellow-painted box upon which, for lack of shelves, Mr. Lewisham's library was arranged, was a schema. In this scheme, 1892 was indicated as the year in which Mr. Lewisham proposed to take his B.A. degree at the London University with honours in all subjects, and 1895 as the date of his gold medal. Who would control others must first control himself, remarked the wall over the washhand stand, and behind the door against the Sunday trousers was a portrait of Carlyle. These were no mere threats against the universe. Operations had begun. Attached by a drawing pin to the roof over the washhand stand, which, the room being an attic, sloped almost dangerously, dangled a timetable. Mr. Lewisham was to rise at 5, and that this was no vain boasting, a cheap American alarm clock by the books on the box witnessed. French until 8, said the timetable curtly. Breakfast was to be eaten in 20 minutes, then 25 minutes of literature, and then to school and duty. But just think of the admirable quality of such a scheme. Up and busy at 5, with all the world about one, horizontal, warm and dreamy-brained, if roused only to grunt and sigh and roll over again into oblivion. By 8, 3 hours clear start, 3 hours knowledge ahead of everyone. Could anything be simpler or more magnificent? In 6 years, Mr. Lewisham will have a sound, all-round education, a habit of tremendous industry, and be still but 24. Where Mr. Lewisham will be at 30 stirs the imagination. He was sitting facing the diamond-framed window, writing fast, on a second yellow box that was turned on end and empty, and the lid was open and his knees were conveniently stuck into the cavity. Suddenly his expression changed. He was listening to a light tapping sound. It was a footfall, outside. He stood up abruptly and, stretching his neck, peered down into the street. He could see a hat, daintily trimmed with pinkish-white blossom, the shoulder of a jacket, and just the tips of nose and chin. Certainly the stranger who sat under the gallery last Sunday next the Frobishers. Then, too, he had seen her only obliquely. He watched her until she passed beyond the window frame. He strained to see impossibly round the corner. It was a Wednesday half-holiday late in March, a spring day, glorious in amber light, dazzling white clouds and the intensest blue, casting a powder of wonderful green hither and thither among the trees, and rousing all the birds to tumultuous rejoicings. A rousing day, a clamatory, insistent day, a veritable herald of summer. "I can't fix my attention," said Mr. Lewisham. He took off the needless glasses, wiped them, and blinked his eyes. This confounded Horace and his stimulating epithets. "Did ever man have such a bother with himself as me?" he asked vaguely but vehemently. "It's self-indulgence, does it? Sitting down's the beginning of laziness." So he stood up to his work, and came into permanent view of the village street. "If she has gone round the corner by the post office, she will come in sight over the palings above the allotments," suggested the unexplored and undisciplined region of Mr. Lewisham's mind. She did not come into sight. Then, abruptly, a cloud drove across the sunlight, the glowing street went cold, and Mr. Lewisham's imagination submitted to control. Precisely as the church clock struck 5, Mr. Lewisham, with a punctuality that was indeed almost too prompt for a really earnest student, descended the narrow, curved, uncarpeted staircase and went forth to his evening preparation duty. The school door was opened by an obsequious little boy with lines to be examined. Mr. Lewisham felt a curious change of atmosphere on his entry. The door slammed behind him, an unusual sense of the greyness of a teacher's life, of the greyness indeed of the life of all studious souls, came and went in his mind. He took the lines, written painfully over 3 pages of an exercise book, and obliterated them with a huge G-E-L scrawled monstrously across each page. A flaw in that pentagram of a timetable was the absence of a clause forbidding study out of doors. It was the day after the trivial window-peeping, a day, if possible, more gracious and alluring than its predecessor, and at 12:30, instead of returning from the school directly to his lodging, Mr. Lewisham escaped and made his way, Horace in pocket, to the park gates, and so to the avenue of ancient trees that encircles the broad Wortley domain. He dismissed a suspicion of his motive with perfect success. The open air, the erect attitude, are surely better than sitting in a stuffy, enervating bedroom. The open air is distinctly healthy, hardy, simple. The day was breezy, and there was a perpetual rustling, a going and coming in the budding trees. He was mechanically trying to keep his book open in 3 places at once, at the text, the notes, and the literal translation, when his attention, wandering dangerously near the top of the page, fell over the edge and escaped with incredible swiftness down the avenue. A girl, wearing a straw hat adorned with white blossom, was advancing towards him. Her occupation, too, was literary. Indeed, she was so busy writing that evidently she did not perceive him. He noted her graceful, easy steps. A figure of health and lightness it was, sunlit, and advancing towards him. Something, as he afterwards recalled with a certain astonishment, quite outside the schema. Nearer she came, and nearer, her eyes still downcast. Still nearer. 10 yards now? 9? 8? Would she go past without looking up? Then their eyes met. She had hazel eyes, but Mr. Lewisham, being quite an amateur about eyes, could find no words for them. She looked demurely into his face. She seemed to find nothing there. She glanced away from him among the trees and passed, and nothing remained in front of him but an empty avenue, a sunlit, green-shot void. The incident was over. From far away, the soughing of the breeze swept towards him, and then something large struck him on the neck, stayed for a startling moment, and drove past him up the avenue. Something vividly white, a sheet of paper, the sheet upon which she had been writing. His awkwardness vanished. Horace in hand, he gave chase, and in 10 paces had secured the fugitive document. He turned towards her, flushed with triumph, the quarry in his hand. He had, as he picked it up, seen what was written. He looked again, eyebrows rising. It had been written with a stylographic pen. Thus it ran: "Come, sharp's the word." And then again, "Come, sharp's the word." And then, "Come, sharp's the word, come, sharp's the word," and so on, all down the page, in a boyish hand, uncommonly like Frobisher minor's. "I say," said Mr. Lewisham, forgetting all his manners in his surprise. He remembered giving the imposition quite well. Frobisher minor had brought the thing upon himself. To find her doing this jarred oddly upon certain vague preconceptions he had formed of her. Somehow it seemed as if she had betrayed him. That, of course, was only for the instant. She had come up with him now. "May I have my sheet of paper, please?" she said. She was a couple of inches less in height than he. "I say," he said, with protest still uppermost, you oughtn't to do this." "Do what?" "This. Impositions. For my boys." She raised her eyebrows. "Are you Mr. Lewisham?" she asked. She knew him perfectly well, but pretending not to know, gave her something to say. Mr. Lewisham nodded. "Of all people. Then you have just found me out." "I'm afraid I have," said Lewisham. They looked at one another for the next move. "Teddy Frobisher is my cousin. I know it's very wrong, but he seemed to have such a lot to do, and to be in such trouble, and I had nothing to do. In fact, it was I who offered." She stopped and looked at him. That meeting of the eyes had an oddly disconcerting quality. "You ought not to have done that," he said. She looked down and then into his face again. "No," she said. "I suppose I ought not to. I'm very sorry." Her looking down and up again produced another unreasonable effect. It seemed to Lewisham that they were discussing something quite other than the topic of their conversation. He made a serious attempt to keep his footing of reproof. "I should have detected the writing, you know." "Of course you would. It was very wrong of me to persuade him, but he seemed in such trouble, and now he will get into worse trouble for letting me—" "Oh, no," said Mr. Lewisham, perceiving an opportunity, and trying not to smile his appreciation of what he was saying. "I had no business to read this as I picked it up, absolutely no business. Consequently—" "You won't take any notice of it? Really?" "Certainly not," said Mr. Lewisham. Her face lit with a smile, and Mr. Lewisham's relaxed in sympathy. He obeyed a foolish impulse. "If you like," he said. "What?" "He needn't do this. The impot, I mean. I'll let him off." "It's awfully kind of you." "It's nothing, really," he explained. "Nothing." He would have given worlds for something more to say, something witty and original, but nothing came. The pause lengthened. She looked at him hesitatingly and smiled again. She held out her hand. He took it, searching a void, tumultuous mind in vain. "It's awfully kind of you," she said again as she did so. Her hand was cool and soft and firm. He held it for a moment, but nothing would come. They shook hands in the manner of quite intimate friends and snatched their hands away awkwardly. "Goodbye," she said, and was suddenly walking from him. Hardly had she gone 6 paces when he was at her side again. "I say," he said, raising his mortarboard awkwardly as though he was passing a funeral, "but that sheet of paper—" "Yes?" she said, surprised, quite naturally. "May I have it?" "Why?" He felt a breathless pleasure, like that of sliding down a slope of snow. "I would like to have it." She smiled and raised her eyebrows, but his excitement was now too great for smiling. "Look here," she said, and displayed the sheet crumpled into a ball. "Oh, I don't mind that," said Mr. Lewisham, laughing. He captured the paper by an insistent gesture and smoothed it out with fingers that trembled. "You don't mind," he said. "Mind what?" "If I keep it." "Why should I?" Their eyes met again. There was an odd constraint about both of them, a palpitating interval of silence. "I really must be going," she said suddenly, breaking the spell by an effort. She turned about and left him with the crumpled piece of paper in the fist that held the book, and the other lifting the mortarboard in a dignified salute again. He watched her receding figure. His heart was beating with remarkable rapidity. How light, how living she seemed. Little round flakes of sunlight raced down her as she went. She walked fast, then slowly, looking sideways once or twice, but not back, until she reached the park gates. Then she looked towards him, a remote, friendly little figure, made a gesture of farewell, and disappeared. His face was flushed, and his eyes bright. Curiously enough, he was out of breath. He stared for a long time at the vacant end of the avenue. Then he turned his eyes to his trophy, gripped against the closed and forgotten Horace in his hand. On Sunday, it was Lewisham's duty to accompany the boarders twice to church. In the evening, on the way to church, the Frobishers and their guest crossed the market square as his string of boys marched along the west side, and the guest was arrayed in a gay new dress, as if it was already Easter, and her face, set in its dark hair, came with a strange effect of mingled freshness and familiarity. He hesitated and raised his hat with a jerk, as if to Mrs. Frobisher. Neither lady acknowledged his salute, which may possibly have been a little unexpected. Then young Siddons dropped his hymn-book, stooped to pick it up, and Lewisham almost fell over him. He entered the church in a mood of black despair. But consolation of a sort came soon enough. As she took her seat, she distinctly glanced up at the gallery, and afterwards, as he knelt to pray, he peeped between his fingers and saw her looking up again. She was certainly not laughing at him. The second hymn was a simple and popular one, dealing with the theme of faith, hope, and charity, and having each verse ending with the word love. At the third repetition of the refrain, Lewisham looked down across the chancel and met her eyes for a brief instant. He stopped singing abruptly. So came the great discovery like a flood across his mind, pouring over it with the cadence of the hymn and sending a tide of pink in sympathy across his forehead. He, Mr. Lewisham, was in love. He hurried back from the school to his lodging. He wanted very urgently to be alone. He went upstairs to his little room. The schema and the timetable hung in the darkness, like the mere ghosts of themselves. Mrs. Mundy called him thrice to his supper. He went out immediately after it was eaten and wandered under the stars until he came over the hill behind the town again and clambered up the back to the stile in sight of the Frobishers' house. He selected the only lit window as hers. Behind the blind, Mrs. Frobisher, 38, was busy with her curl papers. Outside, Mr. Lewisham, 18, stood watching the orange oblong for the best part of half an hour until it vanished and left the house black and blank. Then he sighed deeply and returned home in a very glorious mood indeed. Before school he went through the avenue with a book and back for 30 minutes or so before afternoon school. When Mr. Lewisham was not looking over the top of his book during these periods of open-air study, then commonly he was glancing over his shoulder, and at last who should he see but— He saw her out of the corner of his eye, and he turned away at once, pretending not to have seen her, and after an interminable time, as it seemed, came a faint footfall and the swish of skirts behind him. "Mr. Lewisham?" she said close to him, and he turned with a quality of movement that was almost convulsive. He raised his cap clumsily. "I wanted so much," she said, looking down at her feet, "to thank you for letting Teddy off, you know. That is why I wanted to see you." Lewisham took his first step beside her. "And it's odd, isn't it," she said, looking up into his face, "that I should meet you here, in just the same place?" Mr. Lewisham was tongue-tied. "Do you often come here?" she said. "Well," he considered, "now and then. In fact, I like it rather for reading and that sort of thing. It's so quiet." "I suppose you read a great deal." "I'm rather fond of reading, certainly. Are you?" "I love it." Mr. Lewisham was glad she loved reading. It was pleasant. She would understand him a little, perhaps. "Have you read Carlyle?" The conversation was now fairly under way. She had not read much Carlyle. She had always wanted to. She had heard so much about him. And she had seen his house in Chelsea. She lived quite near, she said, at least within walking distance, in Clapham. "Clapham? That's almost in London, isn't it?" he said. "Quite," she said. But she volunteered no further information about her domestic circumstances. "I hope," said Lewisham, making a resolute plunge, "perhaps while you were staying at Wortley—" He paused perceptibly, and she, following his eyes, saw a voluminous black figure approaching. "We may," said Mr. Lewisham. He had been about to challenge her to a deliberate meeting, but the apparition of Mr. George Bonover, headmaster of the Wortley Proprietary School, chilled him amazingly. "A chance to meet again, perhaps," said Mr. Lewisham, with a sudden lack of spirit. "I hope so too," she said. Mr. Bonover's features, and particularly a bushy pair of black eyebrows, were now very near, those eyebrows already raised, apparently to express a refined astonishment. And then he passed, forehead tightly reefed, so to speak, and lips impressively compressed. Mr. Lewisham raised his mortarboard, and to his astonishment Mr. Bonover responded with a markedly formal salute and the regard of a searching, disapproving eye, and so passed. Lewisham was overcome with astonishment at this improvement on the nod of their ordinary commerce. He was, he felt, singularly stupid for the rest of their conversation, and was glad, positively glad, when things came to an end. At the park gates she held out her hand. "I'm afraid I have interrupted your reading," she said. "Not a bit," said Mr. Lewisham, warming slightly. "I don't know when I've enjoyed a conversation—" "Goodbye." He stood hesitating by the lodge, and then turned back up the avenue, in order not to be seen to follow her too closely up the West Street. And then, still walking away from her, he remembered that he had not made any arrangement ever to meet her again. Mr. Bonover, having fully matured a hint suitable for the occasion, dropped it in the afternoon while Lewisham was superintending cricket practice. "By the by," he said, as if making conversation and still watching the play, "I saw you talking to a young lady in the avenue. Her face was somehow quite familiar to me. Who was she?" "She was," said Lewisham, flushing deeply with the stress on his honesty and dropping his voice to a mumble, "an old friend of my mother's." "And her name?" "Smith," said Lewisham a little hastily, and repenting the lie even as it left his lips. "Ah," said Mr. Bonover, "I was just remarking the odd resemblances there are in the world.
There is a Miss Henderson, or Henson, stopping with the Frobishers, in the very same town, in fact. The very picture of your Miss,
Smith, said Lewisham, meeting his eye and recovering the full crimson note of his first blush.
It's odd, said Boniver, turning towards the schoolhouse. In fact, I hardly expected it of you, Mr. Lewisham.
Expected what, sir? But Mr. Boniver feigned to be already out of earshot. Damn, said Lewisham. Oh, damn, a most objectionable expression, and rare with him in those days. For 4 days and some hours after Mr. Boniver's hint, Mr. Lewisham so far observed its implications as to abandon open-air study and struggle with diminishing success to observe the spirit as well as the letter of his timetable prescriptions. But on Saturday morning his preoccupation with her was so vivid that he decided to go, whatever happened, and see her and speak to her again. The thought of Boniver arose only to be dismissed. And besides, Boniver took a siesta early in the afternoon. Yes, he would go out and find her and speak to her. Nothing should stop him. Directly after dinner, he went by the shortest path to the allotment lane. He went up the stone steps to the stile from which he had watched the Frobishers' bedroom. There he seated himself with his arms folded, in full view of the house. That was at 10 minutes to 2. At 20 minutes to 3, he was still sitting there. It is unaccountable, no doubt, but he felt angry with her as the time crept on. And then he looked round, and there she was, her back to him, reaching after the spiky, blossoming blackthorn that crested the opposite hedge. Remarkable accident. She had not seen him. In a moment Lewisham's legs were flying over the stile. He went down the steps in the bank with such impetus that it carried him up into the prickly bushes beside her. "Allow me," he said, too excited to see that she was not astonished. "Mr. Lewisham," she said, in feigned surprise, and stood away to give him room at the blackthorn. "I knew I should see you," he said by way of answer. I felt sure I should see you today." "It was our last chance, almost," she answered, with as frank a quality of avowal. "I'm going home to London on Monday. I've got a situation. You did not know that I was a shorthand clerk and typewriter, did you? I am. I have just left the school, the Grogram School, and now there is an old gentleman who wants an amanuensis." "This lane," he said. Their talk was curiously inconsecutive. "Somewhere along this lane there is a gate, and that goes, it opens into the path that runs along the river bank. Have you been?" "I told Mrs. Frobisher I should be back by 4, she said. "It's a walk not to be lost." "Very well," she said, with her eyes dancing. And off these two young people went together, in a highly electrical state, to the infinite astonishment of Mrs. Frobisher, who was looking out of the attic window, stepping out manfully and finding the whole world lit and splendid for their entertainment. And neither noticed the light was out of the sky until the soft feet of the advancing shower had stolen right upon them. "Look," he said, "a shed!" And they ran together. She ran laughing and yet swiftly and lightly. They came into a little black shed in which a rusty harrow of gigantic proportions sheltered. He noticed how she still kept her breath after that run. She sat down on the harrow and hesitated. "There's room for 2 on this harrow," she said. He made inarticulate sounds of refusal, and then came and sat down beside her, close beside her, so that he was almost touching her. He felt a fantastic desire to take her in his arms and kiss her, and overcame the madness by an effort. "I don't even know your name," he said, taking refuge from his whirling thoughts in conversation. "Henderson," she said. Her eyes, her atmosphere were wonderful. He had never felt quite the same sensation before, a strange excitement, almost like a faint echo of tears. He moved his arm suddenly and placed it so that it was behind her on the frame of the harrow. "Let us go on now," she said abruptly. "The rain has stopped. I promised to be home by 4, she said. "We may never have a chance to see one another again." "Well?" Lewisham suddenly turned very white. "I have wanted to talk to you so much. The first time I saw you, well, at first I dared not. I did not know you would let me talk, and now, just as I'm happy, you are going." He stopped abruptly. Her eyes were downcast. "No," she said, tracing a curve with the point of her shoe. "No, I am not going." Lewisham restrained an impulse to shout, and, as they went along the narrow path through the wet grass, he began to tell her with simple frankness how he cared for her company. "I would not change this," he said. "I don't care what happens, so long as we have this afternoon." "Nor I," she said. "I can't call you Miss Henderson," he said. "You know I can't. I must have your Christian name." "Ethel," she told him. The little shop in Immering lay back behind a garden full of wallflowers, and was kept by a very fat and very cheerful little woman who insisted on regarding them as brother and sister and calling them both dearie. These points conceded, she gave them an admirable tea of astonishing cheapness. It was after they left Immering that this ramble, properly speaking, became scandalous. The sun was already a golden ball above the blue hills in the west. It turned our two young people into little figures of flame, and yet, instead of going homeward, they took the Wentworth road that plunges into the foreshore woods. "You must write to me," he said, and she told him she wrote such silly letters. "But I shall have reams to write to you," he told her. When at last they came down the long road into Wortley, the silent trees were black as ink, and the moonlight made her face pallid and wonderful, and her eyes shone like stars. Several people saw them, and wondered what the boys and girls were coming to nowadays, and one eyewitness even subsequently described their carriage as brazen. And outside the Frobishers' house, at last they parted perforce. "Goodbye," he said for the third time. "Goodbye, Ethel." She hesitated. Then suddenly she darted towards him. He felt her hands upon his shoulder, her lips soft and warm upon his cheek, and before he could take hold of her, she had eluded him and had flitted into the shadow of the house. "Goodbye," came her sweet, clear voice out of the shadow, and while he yet hesitated an answer, the door opened. He saw her, black in the doorway, heard some indistinct words, and then the door closed, and he was alone in the moonlight, his cheek still glowing from her lips. So ended Mr. Lewisham's first day with love. Monday dawned coldly and clearly, and he went to school sedulously assuring himself there was nothing to apprehend. At 12 came an interview with Bonover, and voices presently rising in angry altercation and audible to Senior Assistant Dunkley through the closed study door. Then Lewisham walked across the schoolroom, staring straight before him, his cheeks very bright. Thereby Dunkley's mind was prepared for the news that came the next morning over the exercise books. "When?" said Dunkley. "End of next term," said Lewisham. "About this girl that's been staying at the Frobishers?" "Yes." "She's a pretty bit of goods, but it'll mess up your matric next June," said Dunkley. "That's what I'm sorry for." "It's scarcely to be expected he'll give you leave to attend the exam." "He won't," said Lewisham shortly, and opened his first exercise book. He found it difficult to talk. Dunkley lapsed into a sympathetic and busy rustling over his own pile of exercises. It was not until the heap had been reduced to a book or so that he spoke again. "You're lucky. I did think I should be the first to get out of this scandalizing hole." "I think I shall have a shot at London," said Lewisham. And then the experienced Dunkley, being one of the kindest young men alive, bethought him of agents. He proceeded to give a list of these necessary helpers of the assistant master at the gangway: Orellana, Gabbitas, the Lancaster Gate Agency, and the rest of them. He knew them all, intimately. "Of course that Kensington thing may come off," said Dunkley, "but it's best not to wait. I tell you frankly, the chances are against you." The Kensington thing was an application for admission to the Normal School of Science at South Kensington, which Lewisham had made in a sanguine moment. The Science and Art Department is wont to offer free instruction at its great central school, and a guinea a week to select young pedagogues who will bind themselves to teach science after their training is over. So Lewisham spent all that duty left him for the next day composing a letter to copy out and send the several scholastic agencies. He found that his work in mathematics and classics was already some time in arrears, and a test he had sent to his correspondence tutor during these troublous days after the meeting with Bonover in the Avenue came back blottesquely endorsed below pass standard. Sometimes he had moods of intense regret for the folly of that walk. His dream of success and fame had been very real and dear to him, and the realization of the inevitable postponement of his long-anticipated matriculation, the doorway to all the other great things, took him abruptly like an actual physical sensation in his chest. That was one mood, the rarer one. He watched the posts with far more eagerness for the address to which he might write to her than for any reply to those reiterated letters of application, the writing of which now ousted Horace and the higher mathematics from his attention. At first he had imagined headmasters clutching at the chance of him, and presently he found himself clutching eagerly at them. He began to put a certain urgency into his applications for vacant posts, an urgency that helped him not at all. Once or twice Lewisham misquoted the testimonial to no purpose, and May was halfway through, and South Kensington was silent. The future was grey. And in the depths of his doubt and disappointment came her letter. It was typewritten on thin paper. "Dear," she wrote simply, and it seemed to him the most sweet and wonderful of all possible modes of address, though, as a matter of fact, it was because she had forgotten his Christian name. "Dear, I could not write before, because I have no room at home now where I can write a letter, and Mrs. Frobisher told my mother falsehoods about you. Even now you cannot write back, for you must not send letters here. It would never do. But I think of you, dear." The dear had been erased and rewritten. "And I must write and tell you so, and of that nice walk we had, if I never write again. I am very busy now. It is hard to be interested in anything just because that is how you have to live, is it not? I don't know when I shall come to Wortley again, if ever, but very likely you will be coming to London. Mrs. Frobisher said the most horrid things. It would be nice if you could come to London, because then perhaps you might see me." So it ran, with singularly little information in it, and ended quite abruptly, "Goodbye, dear. Goodbye, dear," scribbled in pencil, and then, "Think of me sometimes." Reading it made Lewisham feel the strangest sensation in his throat and chest, almost as though he was going to cry. So he laughed instead and read it again. But why that "if I never write again," and that abrupt ending? Of course he would think of her. It was her only letter. In a little time its creases were worn through. There is an interval of 2 years and a half, and the story resumes with a much maturer Mr. Lewisham. Indeed, no longer a youth, but a man, a legal man at any rate, of 21 years. Its scene is no longer little Wortley, embedded among its trees, ruddy banks, parks, and common land, but the grey spaciousness of West London. And it does not resume with Ethel at all, for that promised second letter never reached him, and though he spent many an afternoon during his first few months in London, wandering about Clapham, that arid waste of people, the meeting that he longed for never came, until at last, after the manner of youth so gloriously recuperative in body, heart, and soul, he began to forget. And when Lewisham was already despairing of any employment for the rest of his life, came a marvellous blue document from the Education Department, promising inconceivable things. He was to go to London and be paid a guinea a week for listening to lectures beyond his most ambitious dreams. What a chance to get! Is it any wonder that for 3 memorable years the career prevailed with him? The lapse of time had asserted itself upon his upper lip, in an inaggressive but indisputable moustache, in an added inch or so of stature, and in his less conscious carriage. His costume was, with one exception, a tempered black, mourning put to hard uses and cutting up rusty. The mourning was for his mother, who had died more than a year before the date when this story resumes, and had left him nearly £100, a sum which Lewisham hoarded jealously in the savings bank, paying only for such essentials as university fees and the books and instruments his brilliant career as a student demanded. But the wearing of a bright red tie would have been unexpected. You would have reflected, where had you seen a crowd, red ties abundant, and in some way significant? The truth has to be told. Mr. Lewisham had become a socialist. Lewisham had a strong persuasion, an instinct, it may be, that human beings should not be happy while others near them were wretched. He still believed people were responsible for their own lives. In those days he had still to gauge the possibilities of moral stupidity in himself and his fellow men, and it was only too easy to accept the theory of cunning, plotting capitalists and landowners, and faultless, righteous martyr workers. He became a socialist forthwith. But that was months ago, and by this time the red tie was a thing of use and won't. He turned out of the Exhibition Road, through a gateway of wrought iron, and entered the hall of the Normal School. The hall was crowded with students reading the framed and glazed notices of the Debating Society, students buying notebooks, pencils, rubbers, or drawing pins from the privileged stationer. He looked studiously away from the Debating Society notice board, whereon G.E. Lewisham on Socialism was announced for the next Friday, and struggled through the hall. He heard a shrill whistle, made a run for the lift, and caught it, just on the point of departure. A girl's voice addressed him by name. "Is that you, Miss Haydinger?" he answered. "I didn't see. I hope you have had a pleasant vacation." When he arrived at the top of the building, he stood aside for the only remaining passenger to step out before him. It was the Miss Haydinger who had addressed him. She stepped into the light, with a rare touch of colour springing to her cheeks in spite of herself. Lewisham perceived an alteration in her dress. Perhaps she was looking for and noticed the transitory surprise in his face. The previous session, their friendship was now nearly a year old, it had never once dawned upon him that she could possibly be pretty. She wore glasses, and her dress was indefinite in his memory, an amorphous dinginess. And yet he had seen a good deal of her. They were not in the same course, but he had made her acquaintance on the committee of the School Debating Society. Lewisham was just then discovering socialism. That had afforded a basis of conversation, an incentive to intercourse. Lewisham, for the first time in his life, began to fancy he had conversational powers. She resolved to stir up his ambitions, an easy task. She thought he had exceptional gifts, and that she might serve to direct them. She certainly developed his vanity. Lewisham spent the vacation with an unsympathetic but kindly uncle who was a plumber and builder. His uncle had a family of 6, the eldest 11, and Lewisham made himself agreeable and instructive. Moreover, he worked hard for the culminating 3rd year of his studies, in which he had decided to do great things. He also thought about Miss Haydinger, and she, it would seem, thought about him. Altogether, he had returned to the schools decidedly more interested in her than when they had parted, and the curious vague memories of her appearance as something a little frayed and careless vanished at the sight of her emerging from the darkness of the lift. Her hair was in order. As the light glanced through it, it looked even pretty, and she wore a well-made dark green and black dress that somehow gave a needed touch of warmth to her face. Her hat, too, was a change from the careless lumpishness of last year. It suited her. These things are past a male novelist's explaining. As one goes into the South Kensington Art Museum from Brompton Road, the gallery of old iron is overhead to the right, but the way thither is exceedingly devious and not to be revealed to everybody, since the young people who pursue science and art thereabouts set a peculiar value on its seclusion. And here, on a Wednesday afternoon, were Lewisham and Miss Haydinger, the Wednesday afternoon immediately following that paper upon socialism that you saw announced on the notice board in the hall. The paper had been an immense success, closely reasoned, delivered with a disciplined emotion. The reply after the debate, methodical and complete. Lewisham spoke of his future. Miss Haydinger, for the most part, watched his face. "And then?" said Miss Haydinger. "One must bring these views prominently before people. I have thought—" Lewisham paused, it is to be hoped through modesty. "Yes?" said Miss Haydinger. "Well, there is room, I think, in socialism for a Luther." "Yes," said Miss Haydinger, imagining it. "Yes, that would be a grand way." Lewisham appreciated the quality of personal emotion in her voice. He turned his face towards her and saw unstinted admiration in her eyes. "It would be a great thing to do," he said, and added quite modestly, "if only one could do it." "You could do it." "You think I could?" Lewisham blushed vividly with pleasure. "I do. Certainly, you could set out to do it. Even to fail hopelessly would be great. Sometimes—" Another pause, full, no doubt, of elevated thoughts. "I say," said Lewisham quite suddenly, "you do put, well, courage into a chap." He turned round and stood smiling at her. "You do help a fellow," he said. That was one of the vivid moments of Miss Haydinger's life. She changed colour a little. "Do I?" she said, standing straight and awkward and looking into his face. "I'm glad." "We're first-rate friends, aren't we? The best of friends." She held out her hand and drew a breath. "Always. Just as I am able to help you, I will help you. However I can help you, I will." "We too," said Lewisham, gripping her hand. Her face lit. Her eyes were for a moment touched with the beauty of simple emotion. She snatched her hand back suddenly and turned her face away. Abruptly she walked towards the end of the gallery, and he saw her fumbling for her handkerchief in the folds of the green and black dress. She was going to cry. He followed her and stood by her. Why cry? Nevertheless, he felt vaguely flattered. She controlled herself, dashed her tears away, and smiled bravely at him with reddened eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, gulping. "I am so glad," she explained. "But we will fight together, we two. I can help you. I know I can help you. And there is such work to be done. Has it ever occurred to you," she said abruptly, "how little a woman can do alone in the world?" "Or a man," he answered after a momentary meditation. So it was Lewisham enrolled his first ally in the cause of the red tie, and of the greatness that was presently to come. Miss Haydinger declined to disbelieve in the spirits of the dead, and this led to controversy in the laboratory over tea. Smithers, the square-headed student with the hard grey eyes, argued against the spirits of the dead with positive animosity, and Lewisham, as became the most promising student of the year, weighed the evidence comprehensively under headings. He dismissed the mediumistic seances as trickery. "Rotten imposture," said Smithers loudly, and with an oblique glance to see if his challenge reached its mark. Its mark was a grizzled little old man with a very small face and very big grey eyes, who had been standing listlessly at one of the laboratory windows until the discussion caught him. He wore a brown velvet jacket and was reputed to be enormously rich. His name was Lagoon. He was not a regular attendant, but one of those casual outsiders who are admitted to laboratories that are not completely full. He was known to be an ardent spiritualist. He rose greedily to Smithers' controversial bait. "I say no," he said, calling down the narrow laboratory and following his voice. "Pardon my interrupting, sir. The question interests me profoundly. I have seen spirits, heard spirits, felt the touch of spirits." He opened his pale eyes very widely. "You may have been deceived," said Lewisham. "I can assure you. Others can see, hear, feel. I have tested, sir, every possible way. I ask you, sir, have you given the spirits a chance?" "It is only paying guineas to humbugs," said Smithers. "There you are, prejudice. Here is a man denies the facts, and consequently won't see them, won't go near them." "But you wouldn't have every man in the three kingdoms who disbelieved in spirits attend seances before he should be allowed to deny." "Most assuredly, yes. Most assuredly, yes." The argument became heated. The little old gentleman was soon under way. He invited the whole class, incontinently, to a series of special seances. So it came about that Lewisham consented to witness a spirit-raising. Miss Haydinger, it was arranged, should be there, and the sceptic Smithers, Lagoon, his typewriter, and the medium would complete the party. They were given an address in Chelsea. The house, when Lewisham found it at last, proved a large one with such an air of mellow dignity that he was abashed. Lagoon appeared, opening the door. "We were just going to begin without you," he whispered. "Come along." Lewisham perceived Smithers, standing with an air of bashful hostility against a bookcase. Already seated at the table was the medium, Chaffery, a benevolent-looking, faintly shabby gentleman with bushy iron-grey side-whiskers. He regarded Lewisham critically and disconcertingly over gilt glasses. Miss Haydinger was quite at her ease, and began talking at once. Lewisham became aware of another girlish figure in a dark dress on his right. Everyone moved towards the round table in the centre of the room, on which lay a tambourine and a little green box. The company was already seated before Lewisham looked across Lagoon and met the eyes of the girl next that gentleman. It was Ethel. The close green dress, the absence of a hat, and a certain loss of colour made her seem less familiar, but did not prevent the instant recognition, and there was recognition in her eyes. "Just leave a pinpoint of gas, Mr. Smithers, please," said Lagoon, and suddenly the one surviving jet of the gas chandelier was turned down, and they were in darkness. The moment for recognition had passed. The joining of hands was punctiliously verified. The circle was linked, little finger to little finger. Lewisham sat in the breathing darkness, staring at the dim, elusive shape that had presented that remembered face. His mind was astonishment mingled with annoyance. He had settled that this girl was lost to him forever. Suddenly, a beam of cold air came like a touch against his face and made him shudder convulsively. The musical box somewhere on the table began playing a rather trivial, rather plaintive air that was strange to him. Lewisham took himself in hand at this stage. What was happening he must attend. There was a violent rapping far away behind them, with an almost metallic resonance. Then the rap ceased, and over the healing silence the little jet of melody from the musical box played alone. and after a moment that ceased also. He started. Something had stirred on the table. There was the sharp ping of metal being struck, a number of little crepitating sounds like paper being smoothed, a sense of a presence hovering over the table. In the darkness of the table, something faintly luminous, a greenish-white patch, stirred and hopped slowly among the dim shapes. The object, whatever it was, hopped higher, rose slowly in the air, expanded, and then he saw that it was a ghostly hand, an arm, rising, slowly, deliberately. It crossed the table, seemed to touch Lagoon, who shivered. It moved slowly round and touched Lewisham. He gritted his teeth. There was no mistaking the touch, firm and yet soft, of fingertips. The faint oval of the tambourine rose, jangled, and Lewisham heard it pat Smithers in the face. It seemed to pass overhead. Noise. A loud noise, it seemed. Something moving. Lewisham suddenly missed the medium's little finger. He tried to recover it. He could not find it. He caught, held, and lost an arm. There was an exclamation, a faint report. The little pinpoint of light flew up with a hiss. Lewisham, standing, saw a circle of blinking faces turn to the group of two that this sizzling light revealed. Smithers was the chief figure of the group. He stood triumphant, one hand on the gas tap, the other gripping the medium's wrist, and in the medium's hand the incriminatory tambourine. The tambourine fell noisily to the floor. The medium's face changed. Everyone looked at the man, expecting him to fall, save Lewisham. The thought of Ethel had flashed back into his mind. He saw her leaning over the table as if to pick up something that lay across it. She was not looking at him, she was looking at the medium. Her face was white and set. Then, as if she felt his glance, her eyes met his. She started back, stood erect, facing him with a strange hardness in her eyes. For the moment, her actions simply directed his attention to the object towards which she had been leaning, a thing of shriveled membrane, a pneumatic glove, lying on the table. He pounced and seized it. "Look!" he said, holding it towards Smithers. "Here is more! What is this?" He perceived that the girl started. He saw Chaffery, the medium, look instantly over Smithers' shoulders, saw his swift glance of reproach at the girl. Abruptly the situation appeared to Lewisham. He perceived her complicity, and he stood, still in the attitude of triumph, with the evidence against her in his hand. But his triumph had vanished. "Ah!" cried Smithers. "Good old Lewisham! Now we have it!" His eyes shone with triumph. "Do you see, Mr. Lagoon?" said Smithers. "The medium held this in his teeth and blew it out. This was the luminous hand." That night, as she went with him to Chelsea Station, Miss Haydinger discovered an extraordinary moodiness in Lewisham. She had been vividly impressed by the scene in which they had just participated. The swift exposure had violently revolutionized her ideas. He was a horrible man. Such an oily, dishonest voice. And the girl, I was sorry for her. She must have been, bitterly ashamed, or why should she have burst out crying? She talked in panting little sentences because Lewisham was walking in heedless big strides. I wonder how much such people could earn honestly. Lewisham slowly became aware of the question at his ear. How much they could earn, honestly? I haven't the slightest idea. He was staring before him at unknown things, as if he had already forgotten her. Ethel Henderson sat at her machine before the window of Mr. Lagoon's study and stared blankly at the greys and blues of the November twilight. The door had just slammed behind Lagoon. I wonder what I have done, she said, that I should be punished like this. She certainly looked anything but a fate-haunted soul, being indeed visibly and immediately a very pretty girl. Her head was shapely and covered with curly dark hair, and the eyebrows above her hazel eyes were clear and dark. Her lips were finely shaped, her mouth was not too small to be expressive, her chin small, and her neck white and full and pretty. The room was lined with bookshelves, and conspicuous therein were a long row of foolish, pretentious volumes, the works of Lagoon, the witless, meandering imitation of philosophy that occupied his life. The collapse of the previous night had distressed him dreadfully, and ever and again before his retreat he had been breaking into passionate monologue. The ruin of a life-work it was, no less. Surely she had known that Chaffery was a cheat. She had betrayed him, worse, made him ridiculous. The gesticulating hands had become active, the grey eyes dilated with indignation, the piping voice eloquent. It was, perhaps, not so bad as dismissal, but it certainly lasted longer. And at home was Chaffery, grimly malignant at her failure to secure that pneumatic glove. suppose I brought it on myself. I ought to have picked it up, I suppose. I had time. I never thought I should see him again. He was ashamed, of course. He had his own friends. She sighed, rubbed a knuckle in a reddened eye, rose. She went into the hall and let herself out into the cold grey street. She had hardly gone 20 yards from Lagoon's door before she became aware of a man overtaking her and walking beside her. She looked stiffly in front of her. The man deliberately got in her way so that she had to stop. She lifted eyes of indignant protest. It was Lewisham, and his face was white. "Miss Henderson," he said. "What do you want?" she asked faintly. "I don't know," he said. "I want to talk to you." "I'll walk to Clapham," she said, "if you care to come part of the way." She moved awkwardly. Lewisham took his place at her side. They walked side by side for a moment, their manner constrained, having so much to say that they could not find a word to begin upon. "Have you forgotten Wortley?" he asked abruptly. "No." He glanced at her. Her face was downcast. "Why did you never write?" he asked bitterly. "I wrote." "Again, I mean." "I did, in July." "I never had it." They went on again in silence. "Last night," said Lewisham at length, I have no business to ask, but—" She took a long breath. "Mr. Lewisham," she said, "that man you saw, the medium, was my stepfather." Lewisham paused. "I don't care a rap what your stepfather is. Were you cheating?" Her face turned white. "Mr. Lewisham," she said deliberately, "you may not believe it, but on my honour I did not know, for certain, that is, that my stepfather—" "Ah," said Lewisham, leaping at conviction. "Then I was right." For a moment she stared at him, and then— "I did know," she said, suddenly beginning to cry. I did know, all the time." He stared at her in white astonishment. He fell behind her one step, and then in a stride came level again. "No," he said slowly. "I don't mind even that. I don't care, even if it was that." Abruptly they turned into the King's Road with its roar of wheeled traffic and hurrying foot passengers. He glanced at her face and saw that it was set again. "I understand what you mean," said Lewisham. I know I do. You knew, but you did not want to know. It was like that." "It was kind of you to come, Mr. Lewisham, but you were ashamed. You are sure to be ashamed. My employer is a spiritualist, and my stepfather is a professional medium, and my mother is a spiritualist. You were quite right not to speak to me last night." "Listen to me," said Lewisham. "It is hard to say what I feel, but I'm not going to lose you like this. I'm not going to let you slip a second time. I don't care where you are, what your people are, nor very much whether you've kept quite clear of this medium humbug. You will in future. I had to come and try to find you. It's you. I've never forgotten you. Never." "It can be no good for either of us," she said, as resolute as he, and for some way they walked in grim silence. Presently she spoke. "I wish you would leave me," she said. "You are quite different from what I am. You felt that last night. You helped find us out." They reached the junction and went on towards the common. "I live down this road," she said, stopping abruptly at a corner. "I would rather—" "But I have said nothing." She looked at him with her face white, unable to speak for a space. "It can do no good," she said. "I am mixed up with this—" She stopped. He spoke deliberately. "I shall come," he said. "Tomorrow night." "No," she whispered. "I shall come." She could hide the gladness of her heart from herself no longer. She was frightened that he had come, but she was glad. And she knew he knew that she was glad. She made no further protest. She held out her hand dumbly. And on the morrow she found him awaiting her, even as he had said. For 3 days the laboratory at South Kensington saw nothing of Lagoon, and then he came back more invincibly voluble than ever. There was a joined battle over the teacups. Lewisham, it was remarked by Miss Heydinger, made but a poor figure in this discussion. Once or twice he seemed about to address Lagoon, and thought better of it with the words upon his lips. Lagoon's treatment of the exposure was light and vigorous.
"The man Chaffery," he said, "has made a clean breast of it. The thing is that we were at cross purposes. I told Chaffery you were beginners. He treated you as beginners, arranged the demonstration."
He forged elementary effects.
You can't but admit that.
I don't attempt to deny it, but as he explained, the thing is necessary, justifiable. Is it dishonest, rigging a demonstration?
Of course it is.
Your professors do it.
Well, I don't care, said Smithers. 2 wrongs don't make a right. To rig demonstrations is wrong.
Oh, there I agree with you. I have spoken plainly with this man Chaffery. He is not a full-blown professor, you know, a highly salaried ornament of the Rock of Truth, like your demonstration-rigging professors here, and so I can speak plainly to him without offence. He takes quite the view that they would take, but I am more vigorous. I insist that there shall be no more of this.
Do you mean you're going on with that chap, when he's been caught cheating under your very nose?
Certainly, why not?
Smithers set out to explain why not, and happened on confusion. Lagoon, flushed but cheerful, was on his way downstairs when Lewisham overtook him. "Interesting talk," panted Lewisham. "Very interesting talk, sir."
"I'm glad you found it so, very,"
said Lagoon. There was a pause, and then Lewisham plunged desperately. "There is a young lady. She is your typewriter."
"Yes,"
said Lagoon. "Is she a medium, or anything of that sort?"
"Well," Lagoon reflected, "she is not a medium, certainly. But why do you ask?"
"Oh, I wondered."
"You noticed her eyes, perhaps. She is the stepdaughter of that man Chaffery. Curiously enough, I myself have fancied she might be something of a psychic. Undeveloped, of course. Only a little while ago I was speaking to Chaffery about her."
"Were you?"
"Yes. He, of course, would like to see any latent powers developed, but it's a little difficult to begin, you know."
"You mean she won't?"
"Not at present. She is a good girl, but in this matter she is timid. There is often a sort of a disinclination, a queer sort of feeling, one might almost call it modesty."
"I see," said Lewisham.
"One can override it, usually. I don't despair."
"No," said Lewisham shortly. They were at the foot of the staircase now. He hesitated. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said with an attempt at an offhand manner, "the way you talked upstairs," and turned towards the book he had to sign.
"I'm glad you don't take up quite such an intolerant attitude as Mr. Smithers," said Lagoon. "Very glad. I must lend you a book or two, if your cramming here leaves you any time, that is."
"Thanks," said Lewisham shortly, and walked away from him. The studiously characteristic signature quivered and sprawled in an unfamiliar manner. "I'm damned if he overrides it," said Lewisham under his breath. Lewisham was not quite clear what course he meant to take in the high enterprise of foiling Lagoon, and indeed he was anything but clear about the entire situation. But it worked out to this, that he walked home with Ethel night after night for, to be exact, 67 nights. A curious, inconclusive affair, that walk. It began outside Lagoon's, most punctually, at 5, and ended, mysteriously, at the corner of a side road in Clapham, a road of little yellow houses with sunk basements and tawdry decorations of stone. They talked of this and that, their little superficial ideas about themselves, and of their circumstances and tastes, and there was something that was with them unspoken, unacknowledged, which made all these things unreal and insincere. Yet, out of their talk, he began to form vague ideas of the home from which she came. There seemed to be little sympathy between mother and daughter. The widow had been flighty in a dingy fashion, and her marriage with her chief lodger, Chaffery, had led to unforgettable sayings. It was to facilitate this marriage that Ethel had been sent to Wortley, so that was counted a mitigated evil. But these were far-off things, remote and unreal, down the long, ill-lit vista of the suburban street which swallowed up Ethel nightly. The walk, her warmth and light and motion close to him, her clear little voice and the touch of her hand, that was reality. The shadow of Chaffery and his deceptions lay indeed across all these things, sometimes faint, sometimes dark and present. There had been dreadful trouble at home about the exposure at Lagoon's. Her mother had sided with her stepfather and joined in blaming her. But was she to blame? "Of course you were not to blame," said Lewisham. Ethel did not like talking of Chaffery and these other things. "If you knew how sweet it was to forget it all," she would say, "to be just us two together for a little while." So his knowledge of the situation remained imperfect, and the weeks drifted by. Wonderfully varied were those 67 nights, as he came to remember in after life. There were nights of damp and drizzle, and then thick fogs, beautiful, isolating grey-white veils, turning every yard of pavement into a private room. The fogs passed all too soon into a hard frost, into nights of starlight and presently moonlight. And the way from Chelsea to Clapham was lengthened into a new loop down King's Road, and once even through the Brompton Road and Sloane Street, where the shops were full of decorations and entertaining things. And, under circumstances of infinite gravity, Mr. Lewisham secretly spent 23 shillings out of the vestiges of that £100 and bought Ethel a little gold ring set with pearls. With that there must needs be a ceremonial, and on the verge of the snowy, foggy common she took off her glove, and the ring was placed on her finger, whereupon he was moved to kiss her, on the frost-pink knuckle, next to an inky nail.
"It's silly of us," she said. "What can we do, ever?"
"You wait," he said, and his tone was full of vague promises. Christmas Eve, I know not by what deceit on her part, these young people spent together all day. They walked 16 miles that day, and parted warm and glowing. They went first along the Brompton Road, and it is well that you should have the picture of them right. Lewisham in a ready-made overcoat, blue cloth and velvet collar, dirty tan gloves, red tie, and bowler hat, and Ethel in a 2-year-old jacket and hat of curly astrakhan, both pink-cheeked from the keen air, shyly arm in arm occasionally, and very alert to miss no possible spectacle. The shops were varied and interesting along the Brompton Road, but nothing to compare with Piccadilly.
"I must buy you something,"
said Lewisham, resuming a topic.
"You mustn't waste your money. And besides, I have that ring."
But Lewisham insisted.
"Then, if you must, I'm starving. Buy me something to eat."
An immense and memorable joke. Lewisham plunged recklessly into an awe-inspiring place with mitred napkins. They lunched on cutlets, and they drank between them a whole half-bottle of some white wine or other Lewisham selected in an offhand way from the list. Ethel was aghast at his magnificence, and drank a glass and a half. Then, as they had had enough of shops and crowds, they set off resolutely along the desolate embankment, homeward. It was a day without a flaw, or at most but the slightest speck, and that only came at the very end.
"Goodbye, dear," she said. "I have been very happy today."
His face came very close to hers. "Goodbye," he said, pressing her hand and looking into her eyes. She glanced round. She drew nearer to him.
"Dearest one,"
she whispered very softly, and then,
"Goodbye."
Suddenly he became unaccountably petulant. He dropped her hand. "It's always like this. We are happy, I am happy, and then you were taken away." There was a silence of mute interrogations.
"Dear," she whispered, "we must wait."
"Wait," he said, and broke off. He hesitated. "Goodbye," he said, as though he was snapping a thread that held them together. The way from Chelsea to Clapham, and the way from South Kensington to Battersea, especially if the former is looped about a little to make it longer, come very near to each other. One night, close upon Christmas, 2 friends of Lewisham's passed him and Ethel, but Lewisham did not see them because he was looking at Ethel's face.
"Did you see?"
said the other girl a little maliciously.
"Mr. Lewisham, wasn't it?"
said Miss Haydinger in a perfectly indifferent tone. Miss Haydinger sat in the room her younger sisters called her sanctum, in her black horsehair armchair, staring into the fire, her eyes hot and her chin on her hand.
"I might have guessed before,"
she said. "Ever since that séance it's been different." She smiled bitterly.
"Some shop girl,"
she mused.
"They're all alike, I suppose. Why should he be so deceitful? Why should he act to me? His dissection is getting behind. One can see he takes scarcely any notes."
For a long time she was silent. Her face became more intent. She broke out at last into words again.
"The things he might do, great things he might do. He is able, he is dogged, he is strong. And then comes a pretty face. Oh, God!"
Her face, her pose, softened into self-pity.
"It's no good. I shall never be happy."
She saw the grandiose vision of the future she had cherished suddenly rolled aside and vanishing. The vision of her inevitable loneliness came to replace it, clear and acute. She flung herself upon her knees before the little armchair and began an incoherent sobbing prayer for the pity and comfort of God. The next day, one of the girls in the biological course remarked to her friend that Dingery had relapsed. Her friend glanced down the laboratory. "It's a bad relapse," she said. "Really, I couldn't wear my hair like that." The next day, Miss Heydinger's place was vacant. She was ill from overstudy, and her illness lasted to within 3 weeks of the terminal examination. Then she came back with a pallid face and a strenuous, unavailing industry. It was nearly 3 o'clock, and in the biological laboratory the lamps were all alight. On the door of the classroom was a list of those who had passed the Christmas examination. Lewisham ingloriously headed the second class, and Miss Heydinger's name did not appear. There was, the list asserted, one failure. So the student pays for the finer emotions. And in the spacious solitude of the museum gallery devoted to the Raphael cartoons sat Lewisham, plunged in gloomy meditation. A negligent hand pulled thoughtfully at the indisputable moustache, with particular attention to such portions as were long enough to gnaw. He was trying to see the situation clearly. As he was just smarting acutely under his defeat, this speaks little for the clearness of his mind. The shadow of that defeat lay across everything, blotted out the light of his pride, shaded his honour, threw everything into a new perspective. Things had come so easily to him for the last 2 years that he had taken his steady upward progress in life as assured. It had never occurred to him when he went to intercept Ethel after that séance that he went into any peril of that sort. Now he had had a sharp reminder. He began to think with bloodless lucidity of his entire relationship to Ethel. He cared for her. He loved to be with her and to talk to her and please her. But that was not all his desire. Lewisham saw that it was a case of divergent ways. On the one hand, that shining staircase to fame and power that had been his dream from the very dawn of his adolescence, and on the other, Ethel. And if he chose Ethel, even then, would he have his choice? What would come of it? She was hopelessly poor. He was hopelessly poor. And this cheat of a medium was her stepfather. After all, she was not well educated. She did not understand his work and his aims. He suddenly perceived with absolute conviction that after the séance he should have gone home and forgotten her. He must ask her to forego these walks home, at least until the next examination. She would understand. He had a qualm of doubt whether she would understand. He grew angry at that possibility. Yet that abandonment of walks insisted on looking mean to him. Why mean? Why should she think it mean? He grew angry again. The portly museum policeman, who had been watching him furtively, wondering why a student should sit in front of the Sacrifice of Lystra and gnaw lips and nails and moustache and scowl and glare at that masterpiece, saw him suddenly rise to his feet with an air of resolution, spin on his heel, and set off with a quick step out of the gallery. He looked neither to the right nor to the left. He passed out of sight down the staircase. "Going to get some more moustache to eat, I suppose," said the policeman reflectively. The next night but one saw a new order in the world. A young lady dressed in an astrakhan-edged jacket and with a face of diminished cheerfulness marched from Chelsea to Clapham alone, and Lewisham sat in the flickering electric light of the educational library, staring blankly over a businesslike pile of books at unseen things. The arrangement had not been effected without friction. Evidently she did not appreciate the full seriousness of Lewisham's mediocre position in the list. "But you've passed, all right," she said. Neither could she grasp the importance of evening study. "Of course I don't know," she said judiciously, "but I thought you were learning all day." Her customary tenderness was veiled by an only too apparent resentment, first at him, and then, when he protested, at fate. "Oh, I suppose it has to be," she said. "Of course it doesn't matter, I suppose, if we don't see each other quite so often," with a quiver of pale lips. And this new disposition of things endured for 2 weeks. It did not take Miss Heydinger all that time to discover that the disaster of the examination had wrought a change in Lewisham. She perceived those nightly walks were over. It was speedily evident to her that he was working with a kind of dogged fury. He came early, he went late. He was to be seen on each of the late nights amidst a pile of diagrams and textbooks in one of the less drafted corners of the educational library, accumulating piles of memoranda. He did not meet Miss Heydinger's renewed advances with invariable kindness, yet something of the old relations were presently restored. No type of English student quite realises the noble ideal of plain living and high thinking nowadays, but he makes occasional signs of recognition towards the cosmic process. One such sign was the periodic gathering of the Friends of Progress, an association begotten of Lewisham's paper on socialism. It was understood that strenuous things were to be done to make the world better, but so far no decisive action had been taken. They met in Parkson's sitting room, because Parkson was the only one of the Friends opulent enough to have a sitting room. The Friends were of various ages, mostly very young. All the Friends wore red ties, except Bletherley, who wore an orange one to show that he was aware of art, and Dunkerley, who wore a black one with blue specks because assistant masters in small private schools have to keep up appearances. And their simple procedure was that each talked as much as the others would suffer. Bletherley was going to discourse on women under socialism, and he brought a big American edition of Shelley's works and a volume of Tennyson, both bristling with paper tongues against his marked quotations. Parkson was a man from Lancashire and a devout Quaker. His third and completing factor was Ruskin, with whose work and phraseology he was saturated. He listened to Bletherley with a marked disapproval, and opened a vigorous defence of that ancient tradition of loyalty that Bletherley had called the monopolist institution of marriage.
"The pure and simple old theory, love and faithfulness," said Parkson, "suffices for me."
"Does it work?" interjected Lewisham, speaking for the first time.
"What work?"
"The pure and simple old theory. You meet, too young. You fall in love. You marry, in spite of obstacles. You have children. That's the theory. All very well for a man whose father can leave him 500 a year, but does it work for a shopman, an assistant master like Dunkerley, or me?"
"Chap ought to fight," said Dunkerley. "Don't see a difficulty, Lewisham. If I saw a girl I fancied so that I wanted to, I'd marry her tomorrow."
Lewisham looked round at him eagerly, suddenly interested.
"Would you?" he said.
Dunkerley's face was slightly flushed.
"Like a shot. Why not?"
Lewisham hesitated.
£40 a year. Whack. Yes. When a girl's chosen a man and he chooses her, her place is with him. What's the good of hankering? Mutual. Fight together."
"Good," said Lewisham, suddenly emotional. "You talk like a man, Dunkerley. I'm hanged if you don't."
"The place of woman," insisted Parkson, "is the home. And if there is no home, I hold that, if need be, a man should toil 7 years, as Jacob did for Rachel, ruling his passions to make the home fitting and sweet for her."
"Get the hutch for the pet animal," said Dunkerley.
"No, I mean to marry a woman. Female sex always has been in the struggle for existence. No great damage so far, always will be."
Parkson turned out with the rest of them at 10:30 for a walk. He fixed himself upon Lewisham and Dunkerley, to Lewisham's intense annoyance, for he had a few intimate things he could have said to the man of ideas that night. Dunkerley lived north, so that the three of them went up Exhibition Road to High Street, Kensington. There they parted from Dunkerley, and Lewisham and Parkson turned southward again for Lewisham's new lodging in Chelsea. Parkson was one of those exponents of virtue for whom the discussion of sexual matters has an irresistible attraction. Lewisham suddenly found himself being shown a photograph under a lamp. It represented an unsymmetrical face, singularly void of expression. He perceived he was being given to understand that this was a paragon of purity, and that she was the particular property of Parkson. Parkson was regarding him proudly, and apparently waiting his verdict. Lewisham struggled with the truth. "It's an interesting face," he said.
"It is a face essentially beautiful," said Parkson, quietly but firmly. "Do you notice the eyes, Lewisham? They are innocent. They are the eyes of a little child."
"Yes, they look that sort of eye. Very nice, old man. I congratulate you. Where does she live?"
"I would not show that to everyone," said
Parkson. Then, taking Lewisham's arm affectionately, a thing Lewisham detested, he went on to a copious outpouring on love. The necessity of fleeing Parkson became urgent. Lewisham's temper under these multitudinous stresses was going.
"I have often seen you talking to Miss Haydinger, if you'll pardon my saying it."
"We are excellent friends," admitted Lewisham. "But here we are at your diggings." Parkson stared at his diggings.
"There's heaps I want to talk about. I'll come part of the way, at any rate, to Battersea. You're Miss Haydinger, I was saying."
"Oh, damn Miss Haydinger," said Lewisham. His face was quite white, and he spoke in a tired voice. "Parkson," he said, "you are a fool. You have the face of a sheep, the manners of a buffalo, and the conversation of a boor. Purity, indeed. The girl whose photograph you showed me has eyes that don't match. She looks as loathsome as one would naturally expect. I am not joking now. Go away." After that, Lewisham went on his southward way alone. He did not go straight to his room in Chelsea, but spent some hours in a street in Battersea, pacing to and fro in front of a possible house. His passion changed from savageness to a tender longing. If only he could see her tonight. He knew his own mind now. Tomorrow he was resolved he would fling work to the dogs and meet her. The things Dunkley had said had filled his mind with wonderful, novel thoughts. If only he could see her now. His wish was granted. At the corner of the street, 2 figures passed him. One of these, a tall man in glasses and a quasi-clerical hat, with coat-collar turned up under his grey side-whiskers, he recognized as Chaffery. The other he knew only too well. For an instant the lamplight fell upon her face and showed it white and tired. Lewisham stopped dead at the corner, staring in blank astonishment after these 2 figures as they receded into the haze. He was dumbfounded. A clock struck slowly. Long after the echo died away, he stood there. "She's been at a séance. She has broken her promise. She's been at a séance. She has broken her promise," sang in perpetual reiteration through his brain. And then came the interpretation. "She has done it because I have left her. She has done it because she thinks I am not in earnest. I knew she would never understand." The next morning, Lewisham learnt from Lagoon that his intuition was correct, that Ethel had at last succumbed to pressure and consented to attempt thought-reading.
"We made a good beginning," said Lagoon, rubbing his hands. "I am sure we shall do well with her. Certainly she has powers."
"Was much pressure necessary?" asked Lewisham by an effort.
"We had considerable difficulty, considerable. But, of course, as I pointed out to her, it was scarcely possible for her to continue as my typewriter unless she was disposed to take an interest in my investigations."
"You did that?"
"Oh, I had to. Fortunately, Chaffery, it was his idea, I must admit."
Lagoon stopped, astonished. Lewisham, after making an odd sort of movement with his hands, had turned round and was walking away down the laboratory. That night Ethel had Lewisham's company again on her way home, and the talk that night was a momentous one. "Why have you broken your promise?" he said. Her excuses were vague and weak.
"I thought you did not care as much as you did," she said. "And when you stopped these walks, nothing seemed to matter. Besides, it is not like séances with spirits."
"It is cheating," he said. "Well, even if what you do is not cheating, it is delusion, unconscious cheating. Why don't they thought-read each other? Why should they want you? Your mind is your own. It is sacred. Let them thought-read their daughters and hypnotize their aunts and leave their typewriters alone."
"But what am I to do?"
"Let him dismiss you. Let him dismiss you. You can get another place."
"Not at a guinea a week."
"Well, then take less." She caught at a sob.
"But leave London? I can't do it. I can't."
"But how leave London?" Lewisham's face changed. She explained if Lagoon dismissed her, she was to go into the country to an aunt, a sister of Chaffery's who needed a companion. Chaffery insisted upon that.
"Companion, they call it. I shall be just a servant. She has no servant."
I can't go to his sister's," she cried. I may be a coward, but I can't."
And then Lewisham saw his solution straight and clear. Suddenly his secret desire had become his manifest duty. "Look here," he said, not looking at her. "I won't have you doing any more of that damned cheating, and I won't have you leaving London."
"But what am I to do?"
"Well, there is one thing you can do, if you dare."
"What is it?"
He made no answer for some seconds. Then he turned round and looked at her. Their eyes met. The grey of his mind began to colour. Her face was white, and she was looking at him in fear and perplexity. A new tenderness for her sprang up in him, a new feeling. Hitherto he had loved and desired her sweetness and animation, but now she was white and weary-eyed. He felt as though he had forgotten her and suddenly remembered. A great longing came into his mind.
"But what is the other thing I can do?"
It was strangely hard to say. There came a peculiar sensation in his throat and facial muscles. All the world vanished before that great desire, and he was afraid she would not dare, that she would not take him seriously.
"What is it?"
she said again. "Don't you see? "That we can marry," he said, with the flood of his resolution suddenly strong and steady. "Don't you see? That is the only thing for us. We must marry. We may have to wait for years. We may have to wait forever if we wait until life is safe. We may be separated. We may lose one another altogether. Let us fight against it. This is the only way." She looked at him, her face perplexed with this new idea, her heart beating very fast. "We're so young," she said. "And how are we to live? You get a guinea." "I can earn more. I have thought it out. I have money." "You have money?" "Nearly £100.
"But we are so young, and my mother—"
"We won't ask her. We will ask no one. This is our affair, Ethel. This is our affair. It is not a question of ways and means. Dear one, don't you love me?" She did not grasp his emotional quality. She looked at him with puzzled eyes, still practical, making the suggestion arithmetical.
"I could typewrite if I had a machine. I have heard—"
"It's not a question of ways and means."
"Dare you come with me?"
he whispered. Suddenly the world opened out in reality to her, as sometimes it had opened out to her in wistful dreams, and she quailed before it. She dropped her eyes from his. She became a fellow conspirator.
"But how?"
"I will think how. Trust me."
"But I have never thought—"
"I could get apartments for us both. It'd be so easy. And think of it. Think of what life would be."
"You will come?"
She looked at him, startled. "You know," she said, "you must know, I would love—"
"You will come?" "But, dear, if you make me—"
"Yes!" cried Lewisham triumphantly.
"You will come?"
He glanced round and his voice dropped.
"Oh, my dearest, my dearest."
His voice sank to an inaudible whisper, but his face was eloquent. Two garrulous, home-going clerks passed opportunely to remind him that his emotions were in a public place. On the following Wednesday afternoon, it was hard upon the botanical examination, Mr. Lewisham was observed by Smithers in the big education library, reading in a volume of the British Encyclopedia. Beside him were the current Whitaker's Almanac, an open notebook, a book from the Contemporary Science series, and the Science and Art Department's directory. Smithers wondered for some minutes what valuable tip for a student in botany might be hidden in Whitaker, and on reaching his lodgings spent some time over the landlady's copy. But really Lewisham was not studying botany, but the art of marriage according to the best authorities. From Whitaker, Lewisham learnt that it would be possible, at a cost of £2, 6 shillings and a penny, to get married within the week at the district registry office. He did little addition sums in the notebook. Afterwards, without needless ostentation, he produced a cheque-book and a deposit book, and proceeded to further arithmetic. He found that he was master of £61, 4 shillings and 7 pence. It had been 100 originally. Allowing £5 for the marriage and moving, this would leave about £56. Plenty. No provision was made for flowers, carriages, or the honeymoon, but there would be a typewriter to buy. Ethel was to do her share. But there was much to see to that afternoon. First of all, he had to discover the district superintendent registrar, and then to find a lodging whither he should take Ethel, their lodging, where they were to live together. At the thought of that new life together that was drawing so near, she came into his head, vivid and near and warm. He found the selection of lodgings a difficult business. The first landlady Lewisham interviewed didn't like ladies. They required such a lot of attendance. The second was of the same mind. The third told Mr. Lewisham he was youngish to be married. The fourth said she only did for single gents. The next landlady sufficed. She was a clean-looking German woman, rather smartly dressed. She had a fringe of flaxen curls and a voluble flow of words, for the most part recognisably English. 15 shillings was her demand for a minute bedroom and a small sitting-room separated by folding doors on the ground floor, and her personal services. Coals were to be 6 a kettle, she said, a pretty substitute for scuttle. She had not understood Lewisham to say he was married, but she had no hesitation. 18 shillings, she said imperturbably, paid first day each week. See? Then he went on to Chelsea and interviewed a fatherly gentleman at the vestry offices. The fatherly gentleman was chubby-faced and spectacled, and his manner was sympathetic but businesslike.
"And what can I do for you? You wish to be married by licence?"
By licence.
"By licence."
He opened a book and made neat entries of the particulars.
The lady's age?"
21.
A very suitable age for a lady.
Thursday and Friday, Lewisham passed in exceedingly high spirits. Doubt had vanished from his universe for a space. He wanted to dance along the corridors. He felt curiously irresponsible and threw up an unpleasant sort of humour that pleased nobody. He wished Miss Haydinger many happy returns of the day, apropos of nothing, and he threw a bun across the refreshment room at Smithers and hit one of the art school officials. He added insult to injury by going across the room and asking in an offensively suspicious manner if anyone had seen his bun. The art official said the manners of the science students were getting unbearable and threatened to bring the matter before the refreshment room committee. Lewisham said it was a pity to make such a fuss about a trivial thing and proposed that the art official should throw his lunch, steak and kidney pudding, across the room at him, Lewisham, and so get immediate satisfaction. In the afternoon, however, Lewisham, to his undying honour, felt acutely ashamed of himself. Miss Haydinger would not speak to him. On Saturday morning he absented himself from the schools, pleading by post a slight indisposition, and took all his earthly goods to the booking office at Vauxhall Station. Chaffery's sister lived near Farnham, and Ethel, dismissed a week since by Lagoon, had started that morning to begin her new slavery. She was to alight either at Farnham or Woking, as opportunity arose, and to return to Vauxhall to meet him, so that Lewisham's vigil on the platform was of indefinite duration. At first he felt the exhilaration of a great adventure, and then, as he paced the long platform, came a philosophical mood, a sense of entire detachment from the world. What a flimsy thing he was. A box of books and a trunk of clothes, some certificates and scraps of paper. Did it matter anything to one human soul save her if he ceased to exist forthwith? And miles away, perhaps, she was also feeling little and lonely. Would she have trouble with her luggage? Suppose her aunt were to come to Farnham Junction to meet her? Suppose someone stole her purse? Suppose she came too late? The marriage was to take place at 2. Suppose she never came at all? After 3 trains in succession had disappointed him, his vague feelings of dread gave place to a profound depression. But she came at last, and it was 23 minutes to 2. He hurried her luggage downstairs, booked it with his own, and in another minute they were in a hansom, their first experience of that species of conveyance, on their way to the vestry office. They had said scarcely anything to one another, save hasty directions from Lewisham, but their eyes were full of excitement, and under the apron of the cab their hands were gripped together. The little old gentleman was businesslike but kindly. They made their vows to him, to a little black-bearded clerk and a lady who took off an apron in the nether part of the building to attend. The little old gentleman made no long speeches. "You are young people," he said slowly, "and life together is a difficult thing. Be kind to each other." He smiled a little sadly and held out a friendly hand. Ethel's eyes glistened, and she found she could not speak. Then a furtive payment of witnesses, and Lewisham was beside her. His face was radiant. A steady current of workers going home to their half-holiday rest poured along the street. On the steps before them lay a few grains of rice from some more public nuptials. A critical little girl eyed our couple curiously, and made some remark to her ragamuffin friend.
"Not them," said the ragamuffin friend. "I've only been asking questions."
The ragamuffin friend was no judge of faces. They walked back through the thronged streets to Vauxhall Station, saying little to one another, and there Lewisham recovered their possessions from the booking office and put them aboard a 4-wheeler. His luggage went outside, but the little brown portmanteau containing Ethel's trousseau was small enough to go on the seat in front of them. When our 2 young people found themselves in the cab again, a certain stiffness of manner between them vanished, and there was more squeezing of hands. "Ethel Lewisham," said Lewisham several times, and Ethel reciprocated with, "Hubby dear," and took off her glove to look again, in an ostentatious manner, at a ring. They were resolved that their newly married state should not appear, and with considerable ceremony it was arranged that he should treat her with off-hand brusqueness when they arrived at their lodging. The Teutonic landlady appeared in the passage with an amiable smile, voluble with promises of comfort. Ethel answered Madame Gadot's inquiries with admirable self-possession, followed her through the folding doors, and displayed an intelligent interest in a new spring mattress. Presently the folding doors were closed again. Lewisham hovered about the front room, pulling his moustache and pretending to admire the oleographs, surprised to find himself trembling. He went and stared out of the window, and turned at a sound as Ethel appeared shyly through the folding doors. She was suddenly domestic. Hitherto he had seen her without a hat and jacket, only on one indistinct dramatic occasion. Now she wore a little blouse of soft dark red material, with a white froth about the wrists and that pretty neck of hers, and her hair was a new wonderland of curls and soft strands. How delicate she looked, and sweet as she stood hesitating there. He took 2 steps and held out his arms. She glanced at the closed door of the room and came flitting towards him. For 3 indelible days, Lewisham's existence was a fabric of fine emotions. Life was too wonderful and beautiful for any doubts or forethought. To be with Ethel was perpetual delight. She astonished this sisterless youngster with 1,000 feminine niceties and refinements. She shamed him for his strength and clumsiness, and the light in her eyes and the warmth in her heart that lit them. Even to be away from her was a wonder, and in its way delightful. He was no common student. He was a man with a secret life. To part from her on Monday near South Kensington Station and go up Exhibition Road among all the fellows who lived in sordid, lonely lodgings and were boys to his day-old experience. Lewisham's long hours in the laboratory were spent largely in a dreamy meditation. And Ethel, too, had a fine emotional time. She was mistress of a home, their home, together. She shopped and was called ma'am by respectful, good-looking shopmen. She designed meals and disguised her newly wedded state by a series of ingenious prevarications. She wrote a letter that Saturday evening to her mother. Lewisham had helped her to write it, making a sort of proclamation of her heroic departure and promising a speedy visit. They posted the letter so that it might not be delivered until Monday. It was Lewisham had persuaded her to delay that reassuring visit until Monday night. 1 whole day of honeymoon, he insisted, was to be theirs. In his prenuptial meditations he had not clearly focused the fact that even after marriage some sort of relations with Mr. and Mrs. Chaffrey would still go on. Even now he was exceedingly disinclined to face that obvious necessity. He foresaw, in spite of a resolute attempt to ignore it, that there would be explanatory scenes of some little difficulty. "Let us at least have this little time for ourselves," he said, and that seemed to settle their position. Save for its brevity and these intimations of future trouble, it was a very fine time indeed. Their midday dinner together, for example, it was a little cold when they at last came to it on Saturday, was immense fun. There was no marked subsidence of appetite. They ate extremely well, in spite of the meeting of their souls, and in spite of certain shiftings of chairs and hand-claspings and similar delays. Their eyes were perpetually flitting about the room and coming back to mutual smiles. All their movements were faintly tremulous. "No bridesmaids," he said. "No little children scattering flowers. No carriages. No policemen to guard the wedding presents. Nothing proper, nothing right. Not even a white favour. Only you and I." By way of answer, she extended her hand. "And you know," he said, after that had received due recognition, "we have never been introduced." "Neither we have," said Ethel. "Neither we have. We've never been introduced." For some inscrutable reason, it delighted them both enormously to think that they had never been introduced. In the later afternoon, Lewisham, having unpacked his books to a certain extent, was visible to all men, visibly in the higher spirits, carrying home Ethel's shopping. There were parcels and cones in blue, and parcels in rough grey paper, and a bag of confectionery, and out of one of the side pockets of his overcoat the tail of a haddock protruded from its paper. Under such magnificent sanctions, and amid such ignoble circumstances, did this honeymoon. On Sunday evening they went for a long rambling walk through the quiet streets, coming out at last into Hyde Park. The early spring night was mild and clear, and the kindly moonlight was about them. They went to the bridge and looked down the Serpentine, with the little lights of Paddington yellow and remote. They stood there, dim little figures, and very close together. They whispered and became silent. Presently it seemed that something passed, and Lewisham began talking in his magnificent vein. "We are fighting the world," he said, finding great satisfaction in the thought. "All the world is against us, and we are fighting it all." "We will not be beaten," said Ethel. "How could we be beaten together?" said Lewisham. "For you, I would fight 12 worlds." It seemed a very sweet and noble thing to them, under the sympathetic moonlight, almost indeed too easy for their courage, to be merely fighting the world. "You haven't been married very long," said Madame Gadow, with an insinuating smile, when she readmitted Ethel on Monday morning, after Lewisham had been swallowed up by the schools. "No, I haven't very long," admitted Ethel. "You are very happy," said Madame Gadow, and sighed. "I was very happy," said Madame Gadow. The golden mists of delight lifted a little on Monday, when Mr. and Mrs. G.E. Lewisham went to call on his mother-in-law and Mr. Chaffrey. Mrs. Chaffrey appeared in the half-light of the passage as the top of a grimy cap over Ethel's shoulder and 2 black sleeves about her neck. She emerged as a small, middle-aged woman with a thin little nose between silver-rimmed spectacles, a weak mouth and perplexed eyes. She hesitated, peering, and then kissed Mr. Lewisham effusively. "And this is Mr. Lewisham," she said as she did so. "You'll excuse my saying that it's comforting to see you honest-like and young. Not but what Ethel—" "He's been something dreadful," said Mrs. Chaffrey. "Are we to go downstairs, Mums?" asked Ethel. "He's waiting for you there," said Mrs. Chaffrey. She held a dismal little oil lamp, and they descended a tenebrous spiral structure into an underground breakfast room, lit by gas that shone through a partially frosted globe with cut-glass stars. Chaffrey was standing with his back to the fire, trimming his fingernails with a pocket-knife. His gilt glasses were forward, and he regarded Mr. and Mrs. Lewisham over them with— Lewisham doubted his eyes for a moment, but it was positively a smile, an essentially waggish smile.
"You've come back?"
he said quite cheerfully over Lewisham to Ethel. "She has called to see her mother," said Mr. Lewisham. "You, I believe, are Mr. Chaffrey."
"I would like to know who the deuce you are," said Chaffrey. "For thoroughgoing cheek, I'm inclined to think you take the cake. Are you the Mr. Lewisham to whom this misguided girl refers in her letter?"
"I am."
"Maggie," said Mr. Chaffrey to Mrs. Chaffrey, "there is a class of being upon whom delicacy is lost. Has your daughter got her marriage lines?"
"Mr. Chaffrey," said Lewisham, and Mrs. Chaffrey exclaimed, "James, how can you?" Chaffrey shut his penknife with a click and slipped it into his vest pocket. Then he looked up again.
"Why argue about it?" he said gaily, pointing a lean figure at Ethel's gesture, "when she has 'em in her pocket? She may just as well show me now. Thank you. Lewisham George Edgar, 21, and you 21. I never did know your age, my dear, exactly, and now your mother won't say. Student. Thank you. I am greatly obliged. Indeed, I am greatly relieved. And now, what have you got to say for yourselves in this remarkable affair?" "You had a letter," said Lewisham. "I had a letter of excuses. You did not even refer to the fact that you wanted to marry. Pure modesty. But now you have come here married. It disorganizes this household. It inflicts endless bother on people. But never you mind that. I am not blaming you. Nature's to blame. Neither of you know what you're in for yet. Ethel, my dear, just put your husband's hat and stick behind the door. And you, sir, are so good as to disapprove of the way in which I earn my living."
"Well," said Lewisham, "yes, I'm bound to say I do."
"You are really not bound to say it. The modesty of inexperience would excuse you. But we must argue this out in comfort. You must stop to supper, and you and I must thresh these things out. We've involved ourselves with each other, and we've got to make the best of it. Why not sit in that chair instead of leaning on the back? This is a home, domus, not a debating society. Humble in spite of my manifest frauds. That's better. Have you ever read Matthew Arnold?"
"Beyond my scientific reading."
"Ah, well, you should read Matthew Arnold, a mind of singular clarity. In him you would find a certain quality that is sometimes a little wanting in your scientific men. They are apt to be a little too phenomenal, you know, a little too objective. Now, I seek after noumena. Noumena, Mr. Lewisham, if you follow me. I follow you, said Lewisham, reddening. He had not the courage to admit ignorance of this remarkable word. You state your case. I seek after noumena, repeated Chaffery with great satisfaction. I cannot do with surfaces and appearances. Must pursue the truth of things. I make a rule I never tell myself lies. Never. There are few who can say that. To my mind, truth begins at home, and for the most part stops there. You see my point of view? He glanced at Lewisham, who was conscious of an unwonted opacity of mind. It's a little surprising, you know, if I may say so, to hear you speaking of truth. Not when you understand my position. Now, that is what I am naturally anxious to make clear to you. Now that we have intermarried, and now that you are my stepson-in-law, I gather from this letter and your face that you are one of the party that participated in that little affair at Lagoons. I was one of those who arranged the exposure, said Lewisham. And now you have raised the matter, I am bound to say— I knew, interrupted Chaffery. But what a shock that was for Lagoon. He looked down at his toes for a moment. The hand dodge wasn't bad, you know, he said with a queer sidelong smile. Apart from its moral merits, simply as an artistic trick, it was not bad. I don't know much about tricks. So few who undertake exposures do. You admit you never heard or thought of that before. The bladder, I mean. Yet it's as obvious as tin tacks that a medium who's hampered at his hands will do all he can with his teeth. And what could be so self-evident as a bladder under one's lapel? Lewisham spoke like a man who was lifting a weight. All this, you know, is off the question. I'm not disputing your ability, but the thing is, it isn't right. We're coming to that, said Chaffery. It's evident we look at things in a different light. That's it. That's just what we've got to discuss. Exactly. Cheating is cheating. You can't get away from that. That's simple enough. Wait till I've done with it, said Chaffery with a certain zest. Of course it's imperative you should understand my position, but here's the supper. For a little while, at any rate, we'll call a truce. Ethel had come in bearing an additional chair, and Mrs. Chaffery appeared behind her, crowning the preparations with a jug of small beer. Mr. and Mrs. Lewisham were seated facing one another, and Mrs. Chaffery sat in the broken chair because she understood its ways. For a time the conversation languished. Mrs. Chaffery asked Ethel formal questions about their lodgings, and Ethel's answers were buoyant. "You must come and have tea one day," said Ethel, not waiting for Lewisham's endorsement, "and see it all." Chaffery astonished Lewisham by suddenly displaying a complete acquaintance with his status as a South Kensington teacher in training. "I suppose you have some money beyond that guinea," said Chaffery, off-handedly. "Enough to go on with," said Lewisham, reddening. "I see, but it will be a pretty close shave for all that. Well, as many a deserving man has to do with less." And after a pause, he asked Lewisham to pass the beer. Supper finished, Chaffery invited Lewisham to smoke. Lewisham fumbled in his pocket for his Algerian cigarettes, and Chaffery, having regarded them unfavourably through his glasses, took up the thread of his promised apologia. The ladies retired to wash up the supper things. "You see," said Chaffery, opening abruptly, "about this cheating, I do not find life such a simple matter as you do." "I don't find life simple," said Lewisham, "but I do think there's a right and a wrong in things, and I don't think that spiritualistic cheating is right." "Let us thrash the matter out," said Chaffery, crossing his legs. "Most respectable positions in the world are tainted with the fraud of our social conditions. If they were not tainted with fraud, they would not be respectable. And here is my position. Since all ways of life are tainted with fraud, since to live and speak the truth is beyond human strength and courage, as one finds it, is it not better for a man that he engages in some straightforward, comparatively harmless cheating than if he risks his mental integrity in some ambiguous position and falls at last into self-deception and self-righteousness?" Mr. Lewisham pulled at his moustache. "And after all, these worthy people do not suffer so greatly. If I did not take their money, some other impostor would. At worst, I am a sort of latter-day Robin Hood. I take from the rich according to their income. I don't give to the poor, certainly. I don't get enough. But there are other good works. Many a poor weakling have I comforted with lies, great thumping, silly lies, about the grave." "That's all very well," began Lewisham, "but on your principles you might do almost anything." "Precisely," said Chaffery. "But—" Lewisham took a moment to think. "Anyhow," he said, "I don't agree with this cheating. In spite of what you say, I hold to what I said in my letter. Ethel's connection with all these things is at an end. Ethel is yours, said Chaffery. Ethel is yours, he repeated after an interval, and added pensively, to keep.
At the door, Mrs. Chaffery kissed Lewisham an effusive goodbye and told Ethel she really believed it was all for the best. On the way home, Lewisham was thoughtful and preoccupied. The problem of Chaffery assumed enormous proportions. "Your stepfather is a little hard to follow," he said at last, sitting on the bed and taking off one boot. "He's dodgy. He's so confoundedly dodgy. Of course, all that he said was wrong, quite wrong. Right is right, and cheating is cheating, whatever you say about it." On Saturday, Lewisham was first through the folding doors. In a moment he reappeared with a document extended. "I say," he said, "just look here." She looked at the book that he held open before her, and perceived that its vertical ruling betokened a sordid import. It was Madame Gadow's first bill. Ethel took it out of his hand and examined it closer. It looked no smaller, closer. The overcharges were scandalous. That document, I take it, was the end of Mr. Lewisham's informal honeymoon. Disregarding the extraordinary expenditure on the marriage and the by no means final few little things Ethel had bought, outgoings exceeded income by £2 and more, and a brief excursion into arithmetic will demonstrate that in 25 weeks the balance of the account would be nothing. These details are tiresome and disagreeable, no doubt, to the refined reader, but just imagine how much more disagreeable they were to Mr. Lewisham, trudging meditative to the schools. You will understand his slipping out of the laboratory and betaking himself to the educational reading room and a pile of current periodicals. Lewisham's investigations were twofold. He wanted to discover some way of adding materially to that weekly guinea by his own exertions, and he wanted to learn the conditions of the market for typewriting. His ideas of his own possibilities were youthful, or he would not have spent time in noting the conditions of application for a vacant professorship in physics at the Melbourne University. There was also a vacant curatorship in the Museum of Eton College. The typewriting business was less varied and more definite. It was evident that Ethel's contributions to the household expenses would be by no means despicable, 30 shillings a week, perhaps. Lewisham was naturally elated at this discovery. He saw that a great number of typewriters advertised themselves in the literary papers. It was evident Ethel must also advertise. He returned to his lodgings in a hopeful mood, with quite a bundle of memoranda of possible employments. He spent 5 shillings in stamps on the way. They spent the evening in writing and copying a number of letters, addressing envelopes and enclosing stamps. There were optimistic moments. "Melbourne's a fine city," said Lewisham, "and we should have a glorious voyage out." The advertisement for typewriting in the Athenaeum troubled his conscience a little. After he had copied out his draft, fine and large, he saw the notes she had written out for him. Her handwriting was still round and boyish, but her punctuation was confined to the erratic comma and the dash, and there was a disposition to spell the imperfectly legible along the line of least resistance. They sat at this business quite late, heedless of the examination in botany that came on the morrow. It was very bright and cosy in their little room, with their fire burning, the gas lit and the curtains drawn, and the number of applications they had written made them hopeful. She was flushed and enthusiastic, now flitting about the room, now coming close to him and leaning over him to see what he had done. At Lewisham's request, she got him the envelopes from the chest of drawers. "You are a help to a chap," said Lewisham, leaning back from the table. "Really?" she cried. "Really? Am I really a help?" Lewisham's face and gesture were all assent. She gave a little cry of delight, stood for a moment, and then, by way of practical demonstration of her unflinching helpfulness, hurried round the table towards him, with arms extended. Lewisham, partially embraced, pushed his chair back with his disengaged arm, so that she might sit on his knee. Who could doubt that she was a help? Lewisham's inquiries for evening teaching and private tuition were essentially provisional measures. His proposals for a more permanent establishment displayed a certain defect in his sense of proportion. At the outset he was inclined to regard the South Kensington scholar as the intellectual salt of the earth, and to disregard the competition of such inferior enterprises as the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and the literate North. But the scholastic agents to whom he went on the following Saturday did much in a quiet way to disabuse his mind. Mr. Blendershan's chief assistant in the grimy little office in Oxford Street, cleared up the matter so vigorously that Lewisham was angered. "I say, 1 and 20, no degree, no games, 2 years' experience as junior, wants a headmastership of an endowed school." Mr. Blenderson stared at Lewisham for a moment. "What's he done in the way of certificates?" asked Mr. Blenderson of the assistant. The assistant read a list of ologies and ographies. 50 resident, said Mr. Blenderson concisely. "That's your figure. 60 if you're lucky." "What?" said Mr. Lewisham. "Not enough for you?" "Not nearly." "You can get a Cambridge graduate for 80 resident, and grateful," said Mr. Blenderson. "Not married, by any chance?" said the assistant suddenly, after an attentive study of Lewisham's face. "Well, Lewisham met Mr. Blenderson's eye. "Yes," he said. The assistant was briefly unprintable. "Lord, you'll have to keep that dark," said Mr. Blenderson. "If I was you, I'd go on and get my degree, now you're so near it. You'll stand a better chance." "The fact is," said Lewisham slowly and looking at his boot toes, "I must be doing something while I'm getting my degree." The assistant whistled softly. "I might get you a visiting job, perhaps," said Mr. Blenderson speculatively. "Just read me those items again, Binks." He listened attentively. "Objects to religious teaching, eh?" He stopped the reading by a gesture. "That's nonsense. You won't get a place in any middle-class school in England if you object to religious teaching. Say nothing about it." "But if I'm asked?" "Church of England." "But," said Mr. Lewisham, "it's lying." "Legal fiction," said Mr. Blenderson. "Everyone understands. If you don't do that, my dear chap, we can't do anything for you. It's journalism or London docks. Well, considering your experience, say docks." Lewisham's face flushed irregularly. I won't promise to tell lies if I'm asked," he said. I can't do that." "Scratch it out," said Blenderson to the clerk. "You needn't mention it. Then you don't say you can teach drawing?" "I can't," said Lewisham. "You just give out the copies," said Blenderson, "and take care they don't see you draw, you know." "But that's not teaching drawing." "It's what's understood by it in this country," said Mr. Blenderson. "Put down drawing. Then there's shorthand." "Here, I say," said Lewisham. "There's shorthand, French, bookkeeping, commercial geography, land measuring, but I can't teach any of those things." "Look here," said Blenderson, and paused. "Has your wife or you got a private income?" "No," said Lewisham. "Well?" "But they will find me out," said Lewisham. Blenderson smiled. "It's not so much ability as willingness to teach, you know. And they won't find you out. The sort of schoolmaster we deal with can't find anything out. He can't teach any of the things himself, and consequently he doesn't believe they can be taught. But he puts them on his prospectus, you know, and he wants them on his timetable." "All right," said Lewisham, catching his breath in a faint sob of shame. "Stick 'em down. But mind, a non-resident place." The assistant made a noise, something between a whistle and the word fee. Blenderson glanced at Lewisham and nodded doubtfully. "Fee for the booking," said the assistant. £0.50. Postage in advance, £0.50. "Living in London?" asked Blenderson. "Yes," said the clerk. "Oh, that's all right," said Mr. Blenderson. "We won't say anything about the postage in that case. Of course, it's the off-season. You mustn't expect anything at present very much. Sometimes there's a shift or so at Easter. There's nothing more. Afternoon. Anyone else, Binks?" Messrs. Maskelyne, Smith and Thrums did a higher class of work than Blenderson. Indeed, so superior were Maskelyne, Smith and Thrums that they enraged Lewisham by refusing at first to put him on their books. He was interviewed briefly by a young man dressed and speaking with offensive precision. "Hardly our line," he said, and pushed Lewisham a form to fill up. "Mostly upper class and good preparatory schools here, you know. I doubt if we shall be able to do anything for you," he said reassuringly. "But an English mastership may chance to be vacant. Science doesn't count for very much in our sort of schools, you know. Classics and good games, that's our sort of thing." "I see," said Lewisham. "You don't happen to be a public school boy?" asked the precise young man. "No," said Lewisham. "Well, were you educated?" Lewisham's face grew hot. "Does that matter?" he asked, with his eye on the other's exquisite grey trousering. "In our sort of school, decidedly. It's a question of tone, you know." "I see," said Lewisham, beginning to realise new limitations. "You'll write, I suppose, if you have anything," he said, and the precise young man responded with alacrity to his doorward motion. Messrs. Danks and Wimborne inhabited a bank-like establishment near Chancery Lane, and without any conversation presented him with forms to fill up. "Religion?" asked the form. Lewisham paused and wrote, "Church of England." Thence he went to the College of Pedagogues in Holborn. The College of Pedagogues presented itself as a long-bearded, corpulent, comfortable person with a thin gold watch-chain and fat hands. He wore gilt glasses, and he had a kindly, confidential manner that did much to heal Lewisham's wounded feelings. The ologies and ographies were taken down with polite surprise at their number.
"You ought to take one of our diplomas," said the stout man. "You would find no difficulty, no competition. And there are prizes, several prizes in money."
He furnished Lewisham with the particulars of the college diplomas, and proceeded to other possibilities.
"There's private tuition," he said. "Would you mind a backward boy? Then we are occasionally asked for visiting masters, mostly by girls' schools, but that's for older men, married men, you know."
"I am married," said Lewisham.
"Dear me," said the College of Pedagogues gravely, and regarding Mr. Lewisham over gold-rimmed glasses. "Dear me. And I am more than twice your age, and I am not married at all. 21. Have you been married long?"
"A few weeks," said Lewisham.
"It's very remarkable," said the College of Pedagogues. "Very interesting, really. Your wife must be a very courageous young person. Excuse me, you know, you will really have a hard fight for a position. However, it certainly makes you eligible for girls' schools. It does do that. To a certain extent, that is."
After that, he set out to walk home. Long before he reached home, he was tired, and his simple pride in being married and in active grapple with an unsympathetic world had passed. The day was a greyish one with a dull, cold wind, and a nail in one of his boots took upon itself to be objectionable. Certain wild shots and disastrous lapses in his recent botanical examination that he had managed to keep out of his mind hitherto forced their way on his attention. For the first time since his marriage, he harboured premonitions of failure. When he got in, he wanted to sit down at once in the little creaky chair by the fire, but Ethel came flitting from the newly bought typewriter with arms extended and prevented him.
"Oh, it has been dull," she said.
He missed the compliment. "I haven't had such a giddy time that you should grumble," he said, in a tone that was novel to her. He disengaged himself from her arms and sat down. He noticed the expression of her face. "I'm rather tired," he said by way of apology, "and there's a confounded nail I must hammer down in my boot."
"All right,"
she said, regarding him. And then,
"You are tired. We'll have some tea, and let me take off your boot for you, dear." "Yes, I will."
She rang the bell, bustled out of the room, called for tea at the staircase, came back, pulled out Madame Gadow's ungainly hassock, and began unlacing his boot. Lewisham's mood changed. "You are a trump, Ethel," he said. "I'm hanged if you're not." As the laces flicked, he bent forward and kissed her ear. The unlacing was suspended, and there were reciprocal endearments. Presently, he was sitting in his slippers with a cup of tea in his hand, and Ethel, kneeling on the hearthrug with the firelight on her face, was telling him of an answer that had come that afternoon to her advertisement in the Athenaeum. "That's good," said Lewisham. "It's a novelist," she said, with a light of pride in her eyes, and handed him the letter. "Lucas Holderness, the author of The Furnace of Sin and Other Stories." "That's first-rate," said Lewisham, with just a touch of envy, and bent forward to read by the firelight. "Dear Madam," said the letter, "I propose to send you by registered letter the manuscript of a 3-volume novel. But, of course, before doing so, I must have a satisfactory guarantee that my confidence in putting my work in your hands will not be misplaced, and that your execution is of the necessary high quality." "Oh," said Lewisham, "that's a bother. Accordingly, I must ask you for references." "That's a downright nuisance," said Lewisham. "I suppose that ass Lagoon... Oh, but what's this? Or failing references for a deposit." Well, that's reasonable, I suppose. It was such a moderate deposit, too, merely a guinea. Even had the doubt been stronger, the aspect of helpful, hopeful little Ethel, eager for work, might well have thrust it aside. "Sending him a cheque will show him we have a banking account behind us," said Lewisham. His banking was still sufficiently recent for pride. "We will send him a cheque. That'll settle him all right." The following day, Mr. Lucas Holderness received his cheque for a guinea. He meditated for some time, and then took pen and ink,
and improved Lewisham's careless 1 to 5, and touched up his unticked figure 1 to correspond. And the reader of this story, like the Lewishams, hears of him no more. After all, the rosy love-making and marrying are no more than the dawn of things, and to follow comes all the spacious interval of white laborious light. Try as we may to stay those delightful moments, they fade and pass remorselessly. There is no returning, no recovering, only, for the foolish, the vilest peep-shows and imitations in dens and darkened rooms. We go on, we grow, at least we age. Our young couple, emerging presently from an atmosphere of dusk and morning stars, found the sky gathering greyly overhead, and saw one another for the first time clearly in the light of every day. The stress of perpetual worry was upon them, of dwindling funds and the anxious search for work that would not come, and on Ethel lay long, vacant, lonely hours in dull surroundings. Differences arose from the most indifferent things. One night Lewisham lay awake in unfathomable amazement because she had convinced him she did not care a rap for the welfare of humanity, and deemed his socialism a fancy and an indiscretion. And one Sunday afternoon they started for a walk under the pleasantest auspices, and returned flushed and angry, satire and retort flying free, on the score of the social conventions in Ethel's novelettes. These encounters, indeed, were mere skirmishes for the most part, and the silences and embarrassments that followed ended sooner or later in a making-up, tacit or definite, though once or twice this making-up only reopened the healing wound. There came no work, no added income for either of them, saving 2 trifles, for 5 long months. Once Lewisham won 12 shillings in the prize competition of a penny weekly, and 3 times came infinitesimal portions of typewriting from a poet who had apparently seen the Athenaeum advertisement. His name was Edwin Peake Baines, and his handwriting was sprawling and unformed. He sent her several short lyrics on scraps of paper, with instructions that he desired 3 copies of each, written beautifully in different styles. One fragment was called Birdsong, one Cloud Shadows, and one Eryngium, but Lewisham thought they might be spoken of collectively as Bosh. By way of payment, this poet sent, in contravention of the postal regulations, half a sovereign stuck into a card, asking her to keep the balance against future occasions. In a little while, greatly altered copies of these lyrics were returned by the poet in person, with this enigmatical instruction written across the cover of each: "This style I like, only if possible more so." Lewisham was out, but Ethel opened the door, so this endorsement was unnecessary. "He's really only a boy," said Ethel, describing the interview to Lewisham, who was curious. They both felt that the youthfulness of Edwin Peake Baines detracted something from the reality of this employment. From his marriage until the final examination in June, Lewisham's life had an odd amphibious quality. At South Kensington he dwelt with theories and ideals, as a student should. At the little rooms in Chelsea, there was his particular private concrete situation, and ideals gave place to the real. It was a strangely narrow world, he perceived dimly, in which his manhood opened. The only visitors were the Chafferys. Chaffery would come to share their supper, and won upon Lewisham, in spite of his roguery, by his incessantly entertaining monologue, and by his expressed respect for and envy of Lewisham's scientific attainments. She came because Ethel, in spite of her expressed belief that love was all in all, found married life a little dull and lonely while Lewisham was away. He told no one at Kensington about his marriage, at first because it was such a delicious secret, and then for quite other reasons. So there was no overlapping. The two worlds began and ended sharply at the wrought-iron gates. But the day came when Lewisham passed those gates for the last time, and his adolescence ended altogether. In the final examination of the biological course, the examination that signalized the end of his income of a weekly guinea, he knew well enough that he had done badly. The evening of the last day's practical work found him belated, hot-headed, beaten, with ruffled hair and red ears. He rose, surrendered his paper to the morose, elderly young assistant demonstrator, and walked down the laboratory to the door where the rest of his fellow students clustered. Miss Haydinger stood with her hat in her hand and looked at Lewisham's hot eyes. He was for walking past her, but something in her face penetrated even his disturbance.
He stopped.
"Are you coming up again next year?"
asked Miss Heydinger. "No," said Lewisham. "No, I shall not come here again. Ever."
"What will you do?"
she asked.
"Teaching?"
"I suppose it'll be teaching, I'm not sure. Anything that turns up."
"I see,"
she said. They went on down in silence for a time.
"I was thinking, sometimes one hears of things. What is your address, so that if I heard of anything—"
They exchanged addresses on leaflets torn from Miss Heydinger's little notebook. At the iron gates of the school, she said,
"I am going through Kensington Gardens."
He was now feeling irritated about the addresses, and he would not see the implicit invitation. "I am going towards Chelsea." She hesitated a moment, looking at him, puzzled.
"Goodbye, then,"
she said. "Goodbye," he answered, lifting his hat. He went thoughtfully down to the corner of the Cromwell Road, and turned to the right, so that he could see the red pile of the science schools rising fair and tall across the gardens of the Natural History Museum. He looked back towards it regretfully. He was quite sure that he had failed in this last examination. He knew that any career as a scientific man was now closed to him forever, and he remembered now how he had come along this very road to that great building for the first time in his life, and all the hope and resolves that had swelled within him as he had drawn near. He sighed, and turned his face towards the stuffy little rooms at Chelsea and the still unconquered world. It was late in September that this particular quarrel occurred. Almost all the roseate tints seemed gone by this time, for the Lewishams had been married 6 months. Their financial affairs had changed from the catastrophic to the sordid. Lewisham had found work. An army crammer named Captain Viggers wanted someone energetic for his mathematical duffers, and he paid no less than 2 shillings an hour for his uncertain demands on Lewisham's time. It was now merely a case of tiding over the interval until Viggers paid. The beginning of the quarrel was trivial enough, but by the end they got to generalities. Lewisham had begun the day in a bad temper, and as he emerged through the folding doors, he saw a letter lying among the sketchily laid breakfast things, and Ethel's attitude suggested the recoil of a quick movement. The letter suddenly dropped. Her eyes met his, and she flushed. He sat down and took the letter, a trifle awkwardly, perhaps. It was from Miss Heydinger. He hesitated with it halfway to his pocket, then decided to open it. The breakfast was already over when the quarrel began. Lewisham's morning was vacant, and he proposed to occupy it in the revision of certain notes bearing upon Sandhurst science. Unhappily, the search for his notebook brought him into collision with the accumulation of Ethel's novelettes. "These things are everywhere," he said, after a gust of vehement handling. "I wish you'd tidy them up sometimes." Ethel turned.
"If I put those things away,"
she said,
"you'd only say I'd hidden them. What's the good of trying to please you?"
"None, apparently." Ethel's cheeks glowed, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears.
"Nothing I can do ever does please you, since that Miss Heydinger began to write to you."
Something like astonishment took them both. Hitherto it had been a convention that she knew nothing of the existence of Miss Heydinger. "How did you know it was Miss Heydinger?" Ethel's voice took upon itself the quality of tears. "I wasn't meant to know, was I?" she said. "You mean you think—"
"Yes, I do."
For a brief interval Lewisham stared at the issue she had laid bare. A surging, irrational rage seized upon him. "Jealousy!" he cried. "Jealousy! Just as though I— Can't I have letters about things you don't understand, that you won't understand?"
"You never give me a chance to understand."
"Don't I?"
"No."
"Why? At first I was always trying. Socialism, religion, all those things. But you don't care. You won't care. And because I've got a friend—"
"Friend?"
"Yes, friend."
"Why? You hide her letters."
"Because I tell you, you wouldn't understand what they were about. You're jealous, and that's the end of the matter."
"Well, who wouldn't be jealous?"
He gesticulated forcibly. "This can't go on," he cried. "This can't go on. How can I work? How can I do anything? I meant to work this morning. I meant to look up the notes, instead of which you start a quarrel." The gross injustice raised Ethel's voice to an outcry.
"I didn't start the quarrel."
The only response to this was to shout, and Lewisham shouted. "You start a quarrel," he repeated. "How can one stop in a house like this? I shall go out. I shall go to Kensington and work there." He perceived himself wordless, and Ethel was about to speak. Instant action was necessary. He perceived Huxley's vertebrata upon the side table. He clutched it, swayed it through a momentous arc, hurled it violently into an empty fireplace. He hesitated with the door half closed, then opened it wide and slammed it vehemently. He went striding, heedless of his direction, through the streets dotted with intent people hurrying to work, and presently habit turned his feet towards the Brompton Road. For a time, save for a rebellious ingredient of wonder at the back of his mind, he kept his anger white and pure. Why had he married her, was the text to which he clung. Why, in the name of destiny, had he married her? But anyhow, he had said the decisive thing. He would not stand it. It must end. He was very careful to avoid inquiring what it was he would not stand. He entered the museum and passed beneath the gallery of old iron on his way to the education library. The vacant array of tables, the bays of attendant books, had a quality of refuge. So much for Lewisham in the morning. Long before midday, all the vigour of his wrath was gone, all his passionate conviction of Ethel's unworthiness. What on earth had it all been about? He made a last effort to indict her, to show that she was entirely to blame. But now these accusations faded like smoke as he put them forth. Was it, after all, just possible that in some degree he himself, rather, was the chief person to blame? It was instantly as if he had been aware of that all the time. His mood sank for a space to the quality of groaning. He implicated her now at most as his partner in their failure. What a mess we have made of things, was his new motif. What a mess. He knew love now for what it was, knew it for something more ancient and more imperative than reason. He knew now that he loved her, and his recent rage, his hostility, his condemnation of her seemed to him the reign of some exterior influence in his mind. But how to get back to the old footing? How to efface the things he'd said, the things that had been done? Could they get back? For a moment he faced a new possibility. Suppose they could not get back. Suppose the mischief was done. But we must, said Lewisham, we must. He perceived clearly that this was no business of reasoned apologies. He must begin again. He must get back to emotion. He must thrust back the overwhelming pressure of everyday stresses and necessities that was crushing all the warmth and colour from their lives. But how? How? For now he was assured he loved her still, with all his heart. And suddenly came a florist's window, and in the centre of it a glorious heap of roses. Then he perceived, as though it was altogether self-evident, what he had to do. This was the note he had to strike, among other things because it would repudiate the accursed worship of pinching self-restraint that was one of the incessant stresses between them. He had, he knew, a sovereign in his pocket. He went in. He emerged again with only a few small silver coins remaining out of the sovereign he had changed. The roses were to go to Ethel, properly packed. They were to be delivered according to his express directions at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, Lewisham had reiterated very earnestly. We quite understand, the young lady in black had said, and had pretended to be unable to conceal a smile. We are quite accustomed to sending out flowers. When Lewisham returned from Vigours, it was already nearly 7. He entered the house with a beating heart. He had expected to find Ethel excited, the roses displayed. But her face was white and jaded. He was balked. He went into the sitting-room, and there were no roses to be seen. He was obliged to ask, though he was certain of the answer. Has nothing come? Ethel looked at him. No, she said slowly. Nothing has come. He tried to think of something to say that might bridge the distance between them, but he could think of nothing. He must wait until the roses came. He took out his books, and a gaunt hour passed to supper-time. Supper was a chilly ceremonial set with necessary over-polite remarks. He was resuming his books, and she was helping Madame Gadot's servant to clear away, when they heard a rapping at the street door. They've come at last, he said to himself, brightening, and hesitated whether he should bolt or witness her reception of them. Then he heard Chaffery's voice, and whispered a soft damn to himself. Before Mr. and Mrs. Chaffery, the Lewishams veiled whatever trouble might be between them, beneath an insincere cordiality, and Chaffery was soon talking freely, unsuspicious of their crisis. Lewisham lost something of what Chaffery was saying by reason of a rap outside. He rose, but Ethel was before him. He concealed his anxiety as well as he could, and was relieved when he heard the front door close again, and her footsteps pass into the bedroom by the passage door. He reverted to Chaffery. Ethel returned through the folding doors. She glanced at Lewisham, remained standing for a while, and went back into the bedroom.
Chaffery proceeded to expatiate on the transitory nature of passion and all glorious and acute experiences. Whole passages of that discourse Lewisham did not hear, so intent was he upon those roses.
Why had Ethel gone back into the bedroom? Was it possible? Presently she returned, but she sat down so that he could not see her face. Chaffery was standing to go.
"I could have talked with you longer," he said, "but you have something on your mind, I see. I will not worry you by guessing what. Some day you will remember."
He said no more, but laid his hand on Lewisham's shoulder. One might almost fancy he was offended at something. At any other time Lewisham might have been propitiatory, but now he offered no apology. Chaffery turned to Ethel and looked at her curiously for a moment.
"Goodbye," he said, holding out his hand to her.
On the doorstep, Chaffery regarded Lewisham with the same curious look, and seemed to weigh some remark.
"Goodbye," he said at last, with something in his manner that kept Lewisham at the door for a moment, looking after his stepfather's receding figure.
But immediately the roses were uppermost again. When he re-entered the living-room, he found Ethel sitting in the armchair with a novelette that hid her face. He stared at her, full of questions. After all, then, they had not come. Now he was intensely angry with the ineffable young shopwoman in black. He glanced covertly at Ethel and found her looking covertly at him. He could not quite understand her expression. He fidgeted into the bedroom and stopped as dead as a pointer. He felt an extraordinary persuasion of the scent of roses. Then he saw close by his foot an enigmatical pale object, and stooping picked up the creamy petal of a rose. He stood with it in his hand, perplexed beyond measure. He perceived a slight disorder of the valance of the dressing-table, and linked it with this petal by a swift intuition. He made 2 steps, lifted the valance, and behold, there lay his roses crushed together. He gasped like a man who plunges suddenly into cold water. Ethel appeared in the half-doorway, and her expression was unfamiliar. He stared at her white face. "Why on earth did you put my roses here?" he asked.
"Your roses?" she cried. "What, did you send those roses?"
He remained stooping and staring up at her, realizing the implication of her words only very slowly. Then it grew clear to him. As she saw understanding dawning in his face, she uttered a cry of consternation. "You thought these came from someone else?" he said, trying to grasp this inversion of the universe.
"Yes," she said, "I did."
"Who?"
"Mr. Baines."
"That boy?"
"Yes, that boy."
Lewisham looked about him, a man in the presence of the inconceivable.
"You mean to say you have been carrying on with that youngster behind my back?" he asked.
She opened her lips to speak, and had no words to say. "I never dreamt," he said in even tones. "I don't know whether you think I'm going to stand this, but I'm not." He looked at her. She sat staring in front of her, making no attempt to cope with disaster.
"Think what I have lost in this accursed marriage. I have found out you are shallow, you don't think, you can't feel things that I think and feel. I have been getting over that, but I did think you were loyal." "I am loyal," she cried.
Then she began sobbing.
"I'm as loyal as you, anyhow," she said.
For a moment Lewisham was aghast. Then he perceived he must ignore that argument. "You have deceived me. And I tell you," he began to gesticulate, "no woman shall make me that sort of a fool, whatever else. We are married, but I don't care if we were married 500 times. I won't stop with a woman who takes flowers from another man."
"I didn't take them," said Ethel. "I couldn't help it if they were sent."
"You took them in. You had them. You may have been cunning, but you've given yourself away. And our life, and all this," he waved an inclusive hand at Madame Gadow's furniture, "is at an end." She glanced at his face, and his expression was remorseless. "I will not go on living with you," he said, lest there should be any mistake. "Our life is at an end." Her eyes went from his face to the scattered roses. She remained staring at these. She was no longer weeping, and her face, save about the eyes, was white. "The sooner we part, the better. I shan't stop here with you another night. I shall take my box and my portmanteau into that room and pack. I shall stop in there tonight." He kicked the scattered roses out of his way and dived beneath the bed for his portmanteau. Ethel neither spoke nor moved, but remained watching his movements.
When he had taken all his personal possessions out of the bedroom, he closed the folding doors with an air of finality. He knew from the sounds that followed that she flung herself upon the bed, and that filled him with grim satisfaction. He stood listening for a space, then set about packing methodically. That was about 9 o'clock. At 11 he was still busy. Darkness came suddenly upon him. It was Madame Gado's economical habit to turn off all her gas at that hour unless she chanced to be entertaining friends. He felt in his pocket for matches, and he had none. He whispered curses. Ethel had a candle alight. He could see the bright yellow line that appeared beneath the folding doors. She must have the matches in the bedroom, but that was absolutely impossible. He might even have to ask her for them, for at times she pocketed matches. There was nothing for it but to stop packing. Not a sound came from the other room. He decided he would sit down in the armchair and go to sleep. He crept very carefully to the chair and sat down. Another interval of listening, and he closed his eyes and composed himself for slumber. He listened, but he could hear nothing. She was very still. She was really very still. What could she be doing? He forgot the bothers of the morrow in this new interest. He tried to dismiss his curiosity about the silence by recapitulating the story of his wrongs. Yet presently he slipped again, slipped back to the remorse and regrets of the morning time. He determined he would go to sleep. He tried counting. He tried to distract his thoughts from her by going over the atomic weights of the elements. He wondered why everything was so still. Now, why should he suddenly feel afraid? He sat for a long time trying to hear some movement, his head craning forward in the darkness. He was invaded by a prevision of unendurable calamity. Presently he rose and crept very slowly towards the folding doors. He could hear nothing, not even the measured breathing of a sleeper. He pushed against the inner door very gently and opened it silently. Still there was no sound of Ethel. He opened the door wider and peered into the room. The candle had burnt down and was flaring in its socket. Ethel was lying, half undressed, upon the bed, and in her hand and close to her face was a rose. He listened hard, and his face was very white. Even now he could not hear her breathing. He came nearer, no longer heeding the sounds he made. He bent over her. He saw that her eyelashes were still wet. The pillow by her cheek was wet. Her white, tear-stained face hurt him. She was intolerably pitiful to him. He forgot everything but that, and how he had wounded her that day. And then she stirred and murmured indistinctly a foolish name she had given him. He forgot that they were going to part forever. He felt nothing but a great joy that she could stir and speak. He dropped upon his knees. She started and was awake. "I was in the other room," said Lewisham in a voice full of emotion. "Everything was so quiet. I was afraid. I did not know what had happened. Ethel, dear, is it all right?" She sat up quickly and scrutinized his face. "Oh, let me tell you," she wailed. "Do let me tell you. It's nothing. It's nothing." His arms tightened about her. "I knew it was nothing. I knew. It was so simple. Mr. Baines, something in his manner, I knew he might be silly. Only I did so want to help you." She paused, just for one instant. She saw one untellable indiscretion, as it were in a lightning flash. A chance meeting, it was a silly thing or so said, a panic, a retreat. She would have told it, had she known how, but she could not do it. She hesitated, she abolished it, untold. She went on, "Then I thought he had sent the roses, and I was frightened. I was frightened." "Dear one," said Lewisham, "dear one, I've been cruel to you. I've been unjust. I understand. I do understand. Oh, forgive me, dearest, forgive me. I did so want to do something for you. It was all I could do, that little money, and then you were angry. I thought you didn't love me any more because I didn't understand your work, and that Miss Haydinger. Oh, it was hard." "Dear one," said Lewisham, "I do not care your little finger for Miss Haydinger. I know how I hamper you, but if you will help me,
Oh, I would work, I would study, I would do all I could to understand.
He took her suddenly into his arms and kissed her.
What? I know I'm stupid, she said.
You're not. It's I have been stupid. I've been unkind, unreasonable. All today it's been dreadful. He stopped. They sat clinging to one another.
I do love you,
she said presently with her arms about him.
Oh, I do. I do. I love you.
He drew her closer to him. He kissed her neck. She pressed to him. Their lips met. The expiring candle streamed up into a tall flame, flickered, and was suddenly extinguished. The air was heavy with the scent of roses. On Tuesday, Lewisham returned from Vigours at 5 and discovered Mrs. Chaffery and Ethel in tears. He was fagged and rather anxious for some tea, but the news they had for him drove tea out of his head altogether.
He's gone,
said Ethel. Who's gone? What? Not Chaffery. Mrs. Chaffery, with a keen eye to Lewisham's behaviour, nodded tearfully over an experienced handkerchief. Ethel handed him a letter. Mrs. Chaffery had come upon it in the case of her 8-day clock, when the time to wind it came round. Chaffery, it seemed, had not been home since Saturday night. The letter was an open one addressed to Lewisham, a long, rambling, would-be clever letter. It had been written some hours before Chaffery's last visit.
The inordinate stupidity of that man Lagoon is driving me out of the country, Lewisham saw. I shall miss our long, refreshing chats. You would find me out, and I could open my mind. I am sorry to part from Ethel also, but thank heaven she has you to look to, and indeed they both have you to look to, although the both may be a new light to you.
Lewisham growled, went from page 1 to page 3, conscious of their both looking to him now.
My life at Clapham, continued the letter, has irked me for some time, and to tell you the truth, the spectacle of your vigorous young happiness, you are having a very good time, you know, fighting the world, reminded me of the passing years. I long to see more of men and cities. I begin late, I know, to live my own life, bald as I am and grey-whiskered, but better late than never. There are things, I touch upon them lightly, that will presently astonish Lagoon.
Lewisham became more attentive.
I marvel at that man, grubbing, hungry for marvels, amidst the almost incredibly marvellous. What can be the nature of a man who gapes after poltergeists, with the miracle of his own silly existence nearer to him than breathing and closer than hands and feet? What is he for, that he should wonder at poltergeists? Do you believe that such a thing as Lagoon exists? I must own to the gravest doubts. But happily his banker is of a more credulous type than I. Of all that, Lagoon will tell you soon enough.
Lewisham read no more. The simple fact is, he's stolen or forged or something, and bolted. There was a pause.
What will become of Mother?
Said Ethel. Lewisham looked at Mother and thought for a moment. Then he glanced at Ethel. We're all in the same boat, said Lewisham.
I don't want to give any trouble to a single human being,
said Mrs. Chaffery. I think you might get a man his tea, Ethel, said Lewisham, sitting down suddenly. He drummed on the table with his fingers. He was chiefly occupied by the curious fact that they were all in the same boat. What an extraordinary faculty he had for acquiring responsibility. He looked up suddenly and caught Mrs. Chaffery's tearful eye, and his perplexity was suddenly changed to pity. It's all right, Mother, he said. I'm not going to be unreasonable. I'll stand by you.
Ah, said Mrs. Chaffery, as if I didn't know.
And Ethel came and kissed him. He seemed in imminent danger of universal embraces. He did not get to bed until nearly 2. By that time a course of action was already agreed upon. Mrs. Chaffery was tied to the house in Clapham by a long lease, and thither they must go. The ground floor and first floor were let unfurnished, and the rent of these practically paid the rent of the house. The Chafferys occupied basement and second floor. There was a bedroom on the second floor formerly let to the first-floor tenants that he and Ethel could occupy, and in this an old toilet table could be put for such studies as were to be prosecuted at home. Ethel could have her typewriter in the subterranean breakfast-room. Mrs. Chaffery and Ethel must do the catering and the bulk of the housework. When at last Mrs. Chaffery, after a violent and tearful kissing and blessing of them both, they were "good dear children," she said, had departed, Mr. and Mrs. Lewisham returned into their sitting-room. Mrs. Lewisham's little face was enthusiastic.
"You're a trump," she said, extending the willing arms that were his reward.
The next day, Lewisham was too full of engagements to communicate with Lagoon, but the following morning he called and stated his case with some bluntness.
"He was last here on Saturday," said Lagoon. "Have you any grounds?"
"You'd better read this," said Lewisham, repressing a grim smile, and he handed Lagoon Chaffery's letter. Lagoon blew out his cheeks in the most astonishing way, but made no other sign.
"Dear, dear," he said at last. "My bankers."
He looked at Lewisham with the exaggerated mildness of his spectacled eye.
"What do you think it means?" he asked. "Has he gone mad?"
"I should look at my cheque-book, if I were you." Lagoon produced some keys and got out his cheque-book. He turned over the counterfoils.
"There's nothing wrong here," he said,
and handed the book to Lewisham. Said Lewisham. "I say, is this right?" He handed back the book to Lagoon, open at the blank counterfoil of a cheque that had been removed. Lagoon stared and passed his hand over his forehead in a confused way.
"I can't see this," he said.
Lewisham had never heard of post-hypnotic suggestion, and he stood incredulous. "You can't see that," he said. "What nonsense!"
"I can't see it,"
repeated Lagoon. "But look here. Can you see this counterfoil?"
"Plainly,"
said Lagoon. "Can you read the number?"
5,279.
"Well, and this?"
5,281.
"Well, where's 5,280? Lagoon began to look uncomfortable.
"Surely," he said, "he has not. Will you read it out, the cheque, the counterfoil, I mean, that I am unable to see?"
"It's blank," said Lewisham with an irresistible grin.
"I'm afraid," said Lagoon, "that I have been shabbily treated. Mr. Chaffery is a man of indisputable powers, but I am very much afraid, that he has abused the conditions of the experiment. All this and his insults touch me rather nearly."
He paused. Lewisham rose.
"Do you mind if you come again?"
asked Lagoon with gentle politeness. Lewisham was surprised to find himself sorry. When he saw Lagoon again, he learnt the particulars of Chaffery's misdeed. He had induced Lagoon, when hypnotized, to sign a blank cheque as an autograph.
"The strange thing is," explained Lagoon, "it's doubtful if he's legally accountable. The law is so peculiar about hypnosis, and I certainly signed the cheque, you know."
The little man, in spite of his losses, was now almost cheerful again, on account of a curious side issue.
"Consider this. The amount of my balance is a secret between me and my bankers, but he drew it all in one cheque, within 17 and sixpence of the total, and the total was over £500. Now, how do you account for that, eh? Give a materialistic explanation that will explain away all that."
"I think I can," said Lewisham.
"Well, what is it?"
Lewisham nodded towards a little drawer of the bureau. "Don't you think perhaps," a little ripple of laughter passed across his mind, "he had a skeleton key?" Lagoon's face lingered amusingly in Lewisham's mind as he returned to Clapham, but after a time that amusement passed away. He declined upon the extraordinary fact that Chaffery was his father-in-law, Mrs. Chaffery his mother-in-law, that these two and Ethel constituted his family, his clan, and that grimy, graceless house up the Clapham hillside was to be his home. And a year ago, except for a fading reminiscence of Ethel, none of these people had existed for him. The thing took him suddenly as being laughable, and he laughed. His laugh marked an epoch. Never before had Lewisham laughed at any fix in which he had found himself. The enormous seriousness of adolescence was coming to an end. The days of his growing were numbered. Now, although Lewisham had promised to bring things to a conclusion with Miss Haydinger, he did nothing in the matter for 5 weeks. In that time, their removal from Madame Gaddow's into the gaunt house at Clapham was accomplished, and the young couple settled themselves into the little room on the second floor, even as they had arranged. And there it was that suddenly the world was changed, was astonishingly transfigured, by a whisper. It was a whisper with Ethel's arms about him and Ethel's hair streaming down so that it hid her face from him. And he too had whispered, dismayed perhaps a little, and yet feeling a strange pride, a strange novel emotion, feeling altogether different from the things he had fancied he might feel when this thing that he had dreaded should come. Suddenly he perceived finality the advent of the solution, the reconciliation of the conflict that had been waged so long. Hesitations were at an end. Next day he wrote a note, and 2 mornings later went over the bridge to Battersea Park. There, waiting for him by a seat where once they had met before, he found Miss Heydinger pacing. "You have something to tell me," said Miss Heydinger abruptly. Lewisham changed colour a little. "Oh, yes," he said. "The fact is—" He affected ease. "Did I ever tell you I was married?"
Married?
For a moment neither spoke. Lewisham stood without dignity, staring at the dahlias of the London County Council, and Miss Heydinger stood regarding him. "I might have known," she said. "I might have known. Tell me some more. Tell me about her." Lewisham did. The whole thing was abominably disagreeable to him, but it had to be done. He had promised Ethel it should be done.
"And you were married before the second examination?"
"Yes," said Lewisham.
"I suppose you had to do it," she said presently, with her eyes on his profile.
Lewisham began the second and more difficult part of his explanation. "There's been a difficulty," he said, "all the way along. I mean, she knows you write to me, and she knows you write about socialism and literature and things we have in common, things she hasn't."
"And she objects?"
"No," said Lewisham, lying promptly. "She doesn't object."
"Well?"
said Miss Heydinger, and her face was white. "She feels that— She feels, she does not say, of course, but I know that she feels that it is something she ought to share, and it shames her. Don't you see how it hurts her?" She spoke at last with an effort.
"That it hurts me,"
she said, and grimaced and stopped again.
"You love her?"
"I wonder if it's that makes the difference. Things are so complex. Love means anything or nothing. I know you better than I do her. You know me better than she will ever do. I could tell you things I could not tell her. Only—"
"You love her?"
"Yes," said Lewisham lamely and pulling at his moustache. "I suppose that must be it." For a space neither spoke. Then Miss Heydinger said,
"To think of this end to it all, that all your promise. What is it she gives you that I could not have given? Why should I give up that much of you that is mine? If she could take it, but she cannot take it. If I let you go, you will do nothing. All this ambition, all these interests will dwindle and die. And she will not mind. She will not understand. Even now," she said, "you may do great things. If only I might see you sometimes, write to you sometimes. Why need she know? It robs her of nothing. I want nothing she has. It is only knowing hurts her. Why should she know?"
Mr. Lewisham looked at her doubtfully. That phantom greatness of his, it was that lit her eyes. But he knew that in some way the secret of his greatness and this admiration went together. Why indeed need Ethel know? He hesitated, and suddenly had a vision of Ethel weeping, as once he had seen her weep, with the light on the tears in her eyes. "No," he said almost brutally. "No, it's like this. I can't do anything underhand. I mean, well, it would do no good, and she would find me out. My life's too complex. You've overrated me. And besides, things have happened. Something—" He hesitated, and then snatched at his resolve. "I've got to simplify, and that's the plain fact of the case. I'm sorry, but it is so." Miss Heydinger made no answer. Her silence astonished him. For nearly 20 seconds, perhaps, they sat without speaking.
"Goodbye,"
she said suddenly in a low tone, and held out her hand. He took her hand. "I hope I didn't—"
"Goodbye,"
she said impatiently, and suddenly disengaged her hand and turned away from him. He remained motionless, watching her retreating figure. An extraordinary sense of loss came into his mind, a vague impulse to pursue her and pour out vague, passionate protestations. Not once did she look back. She was already remote when he began hurrying after her. His pace slackened. He stopped, hesitating. An impertinent thought obtruded.
He looked at his watch and saw that he must hurry if he would catch the train for Earl's Court and Vickers. He said Vickers might go to the devil, but in the end he caught his train. That night, about 7, Ethel came into their room with a waste-paper basket she had bought for him, and found him sitting at the little toilet table at which he was to write. She showed him the basket and put it beside him, and then her eye caught the yellow document in his hand.
What is it you have there?
He held it out to her. I found it, lining my yellow box. I had it at Wortley. She took it and perceived a chronological scheme. It was headed Schema. There were memoranda in the margin, and all the dates had been altered by a hasty hand.
Hasn't it got yellow?
She said. There was an interval. He became aware of her hand upon his shoulder, that she was bending over him.
Dear,
she whispered, with a strange change in the quality of her voice. He knew she was seeking to say something that was difficult to say.
Yes, he said presently.
You are not grieving?
What about?
This.
No.
You're not even sorry?
She said. No, not even sorry. She looked at him doubtfully. He put his arm about her, and presently, and almost absent-mindedly, she obeyed his pressure and bent down and kissed him.
It settles things,
he said, holding her.
It joins us, don't you see? It's something we have between us. It's something that... It's the link we needed. It will be our life. This will be my work now. The other...
He faced a truth. It was just... vanity.
I know I'm stupid, she said. The things I say aren't the things I feel.
I think I understand, he said, and wrestled with the impalpable. She lapsed abruptly into the prosaic. She started from him.
If I don't go down, Mother will get the supper.
He listened to her footsteps until the kitchen had swallowed them up. Then he turned his eyes to the Schema again, and for a moment it seemed but a little thing. He picked it up in both hands and looked at it as if it was the writing of another man, and indeed it was the writing of another man. Yes, it was vanity, he said, a boy's vanity. His thoughts went to his socialism, to his red-hot ambition of world-mending. He marvelled at the vistas he had discovered since those days. Not for us. Not for us.
Come to think, it is all the child. The future is the child. The future. What are we, any of us, but servants or traitors to that?
His eyes came back to the Schema. The vision of that arranged career, that ordered sequence of work and successes, distinctions, and yet further distinctions, rose brightly from the symbol. Then he compressed his lips and tore the yellow sheet in half, tearing very deliberately. He doubled the halves and tore again, doubled again very carefully and neatly, until the Schema was torn into numberless little pieces. With it he seemed to be tearing his past self.
It is the end of adolescence, he said.
The end of empty dreams. He became very still, his hands resting on the table, his eyes staring out of the blue oblong of the window. He found he was still holding the torn fragments. He stretched out his hand and dropped them into that new waste-paper basket Ethel had bought for him. 2 pieces fell outside the basket. He stooped, picked them up, and put them carefully with their fellows.
Love and Mr Lewisham was abridged and read by Paul Daneman. The producer was Maurice Leach.